November 7th, a different night for us. It is the Norton Charter Commission meeting. All members are present. If we could stand and salute the flag, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Alrighty, it's a short agenda tonight, which is good. Seeing nobody in the gallery, I'm going to assume we have nobody who would like to speak. This evening, we are very lucky to have, from the Mass Municipal Association, two gentlemen representing the Form of Government Committee. We have, to the right, Michael Dutton. He is the town manager of Bridgewater. Bridgewater has a town council form of government, and he was formerly the chief administrator officer for the town of Oak Bluffs in Martha's Vineyard, which had an open town meeting form of government. And to the left, we have William Keegan. He is the town manager of Foxborough, which has open town meeting form of government, and was formerly the town administrator of Dedham, which has representative town meeting. And if it's okay with you folks and everybody here, I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman and let them give a little bit of, yes?
I just want to remind you to mention it in recording.
Oh, well, there's nobody in the gallery really to record. Are either of you gentlemen taping this meeting?
Oh, no. We've been to enough meetings.
I did just want to point out, Lauren's admin had called and asked if I could push her any later than 8:15. I told her 8:30 was about as late as we were willing to go, so we may recess in between. We do need to take a vote on remote participation. But other than that, if we don't really have anything to discuss, we'll recess for a short time until Lauren arrives. And I lost my place. So we were going to let the folks from the Form of Government Committee give us a little bit of background about their specific roles, their towns, and how they came to be here, and hopefully give us a little bit of guidance. And then we'll open it up to specific questions and answers that anybody has for them.
There we go.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having Bill and me. It's Form of Government Committee is actually Massachusetts Municipal Managers Association, which is sort of under the umbrella of the MMA, but we're usually careful to mention that it's really under the Municipal Managers Association purview. Bill's been chair of the Form of Government Committee in years past. I'm new to it, new to the chair, and been on the committee for a few years, so it's really a committee put together to provide a resource for folks exactly like you that have questions about different forms of government and how different forms work on a practical level. I mean, you can read about it in theory, but really on a practical level, on a day-to-day basis, how does it really work, one form or the other? We provide advice on charter changes. We provide some advice on practical advice on ordinances that may sort of change the form of government, something short of a wholesale revision in how you're governing yourselves. But essentially, we're a resource, so we're happy to be here. We don't have a political dog in any fight. Certainly, we were both saying this is our first time here, so hopefully that gives you an idea that we don't have any dog in the political fight, if there is a political fight, so we don't even know if there is one. So it's really just straight advice, and we try to be as impartial and relate our experiences and let you decide what you want to do, obviously. So I come I was a town administrator out on Martha's Vineyard for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was an elected official. I was a selectman in the same town that I ended up being the town administrator in, and I wouldn't recommend that. That's very awkward in retrospect, but it gave me an opportunity to really understand government. Prior to that, I was in the private sector. I was a hospital administrator. I worked in the banking industry. And so I've done a lot of different things, but I tell people that of all the different sectors that I've worked in and managed, by far the most difficult is municipal government. The least rewarding, sometimes the least gratifying. Why are we in this? No, it's actually, it is very rewarding and very satisfying and it's something different all the time. So that's really, what sort of made me gravitate towards it. In terms of the form of government, I had open town meeting when I was out on the island. Generally, we'd have town meeting attendance of between, if we were lucky, about between 100 and 200 folks. So it was a pretty actively engaged community. That worked for that particular community. When I came over to Bridgewater had just a couple of years earlier switched from an open town meeting form of government, went right completely to a council manager form of government, and I can tell you that having gone through not the election, but having gone through the aftermath and the changes, if you ever get to that point where you're recommending that to your voters, make sure that you have thought through that process, the process of that change very thoroughly, because the voters in Bridgewater voted to change their government and never really anticipated what would come after that. So it was a very rocky road, and for those that read the papers back in 2010, you probably in that time period, you probably remember the bit of a fiasco that it was. So really think about that transition. I can certainly go into, later on, I can certainly tell you how the council manager form of government works, and give you some sort of very basic highlights and attributes to that versus town meeting form of government, if you want to know that. Very basically, the legislative branch in a council manager form of government is the town council. So the town council, what I tell people that really want to get a pretty basic understanding is the town council form of government, the town council takes the place of town meeting. So it's like having town meeting twice a month, but they're the legislative body, and I take the place of the selectmen. I am the one that carries out the legislative acts that the town council makes. Town council, I formulate the budget. I propose a comprehensive general fund budget as well as enterprise fund budget to the council. They hold hearings. There are certain limits on what they can change and how they can shift money around within the budget I've proposed, but very basically I propose the budget, they vote the budget. They've got 45 days after I present it in which to vote it. If they don't vote it within 45 days, then it takes effect automatically. So we've never had a time, knock on wood, where I have proposed a budget and the council has wanted something significantly different. We go through a very detailed and lengthy process in terms of the budget, similar to probably what you go through. It's very participatory. In our case, we have a lot of hearings on the budget, but the initial budget is developed internally. I work with the department heads. The finance director works very closely with the department heads to develop the budget. I can tell you that for me, certainly over the first 4 or 5 years, it was a lot easier because Bridgewater had significant financial problems. So I think politically it was easier for the elected officials to just say, here, you do it. Whatever you come up with is going to be pretty much okay because anything's better than what we have now. And that was good for me as a new town manager in a new place. But now that we're in much different financial condition, some of the preferences and some of the ideas that the council as a whole have are sort of shifting, and some of their priorities will begin to affect how I develop the budget moving forward. So it'll probably honestly be a little more difficult, but that's absolutely fine. The budget really is your strategic statement on a year-to-year basis. So having money makes a lot of difference. good, positive difference. And I think our budget process this year will probably be very collaborative. It has been over the last 6-7 years, and I think it will be again. But I think we'll have a lot more discussion about, where the council's priorities are, where my priorities are, and we'll probably get to a slightly different budget, but basically similar to what we have now. So what else can I tell you? All of the committees that we have in Bridgewater, and we've got about 22 different committees, probably 15 of them are pretty active. The rest are somewhat dormant. There are a couple of committees that I have not appointed people to at this point that are reflected in our administrative code. I appoint all the members of all the committees, and the council ratifies my appointments. There is really two exceptions. The Board of Registrars, I'm limited to who I can appoint. Obviously, I have to have a Democrat and a Republican and balance it that way, but I still appoint those folks based on recommendations of the town political parties. The other exception is the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee was a creature of our charter. I think at the time it was a compromise between those who didn't want to switch from town meeting form of government or were uncomfortable about people, specifically Finance Committee, losing some say in the process. So the Finance Committee, unlike most city forms of government, which is what Bridgewater is, the Finance Committee was created under the charter. It is made up of 9 members, 3 of whom are appointed by me, 3 of whom are appointed by the council, and 3 of whom are appointed by the town clerk. The town clerk is the only elected full-time position in the town. And there was an effort last year with some of the charter revisions. The charter committee that we had set up, or that the council had set up 2 or 3 years prior, finished their work and recommended that the town clerk now become an appointed official. And that went to the legislature. The legislature approved it, came back to be voted by the voters. The voters turned that down by a small margin. So we still have an elected clerk, and we have the only other elected officials other than the town council are the Board of Library Trustees. So those are the only elected officials. All of the committees, I appoint the members of all the committees, and the council ratifies them with those 2 exceptions, the Finance Committee and the Board of Registrars.
That's a quick clarification question. So you mentioned, I think I heard you say, you develop your budget and it goes to the town council. So what is the role of the Finance Committee there if you're working with the town council on the budget?
That's an excellent question, and actually that's one that we're wrestling with right now, because as time goes on, we realize that the Finance Committee was only really created as a compromise, and they struggle with their role. Our charter says that every financial matter, and I think that's the terminology, every financial matter must go to the Finance Committee to be heard. They can choose not to recommend something, but they have to hear the issue. That's how the charter's written. So we also have one of the standing committees of the council. The council has 5 standing committees. One of them is Budget and Finance. So there's really duplicate effort going on. What I have told the Finance Committee, from my perspective, excuse me, is our capital plan was non-existent 6 years ago. Today, we have developed a capital plan internally. It's quite robust, but I would like a committee to sort of serve as the capital plan committee. And so I've sort of given the Finance Committee that charge. They haven't quite grabbed onto it yet, but I think they will moving forward. So your question is a really good one. If I were being honest, I'd say the Finance Committee has really no significant role right now, and is really there because it was a compromise. It was created by a compromise that was all aimed at getting the votes necessary to pass the charter.
How often do they meet?
Sorry?
How often does your FinCom meet?
Finance Committee, they have a standing schedule of twice a month. Effectively, they meet probably once a month, but they've struggled to get a quorum over the last several months, so.
Do you attend their meetings?
I used to in the beginning, because we had such financial difficulties. I think I attended most of the meetings, all the meetings. We now have a finance director who generally attends their meetings, and I generally do not. So I'm very lucky. I've got a great finance director who will attend the finance committee as well as the budget and finance committee. So.
Well, that was my next question, is do you attend the standing committee's meetings? But it's the finance
It depends.
director?
Yeah, the
Okay.
finance director usually attends the budget and finance. So I'll end and let Bill tell you his experience with council. The council has 5 standing committees. The most active really is the budget and finance committee for what are probably obvious reasons. We have a community and economic development standing committee. All the committees are made up of 3 counselors. And we're pretty careful about not having more than 3 counselors because we don't want to create any kind of risk of developing a quorum of the whole council. So budget and finance, community and economic development, public safety, rules and procedures, and then we have I think we call it a partner, under their council rules, I think it's called a partnership committee, and that was developed at a time when the relationship between Bridgewater and Bridgewater State University was at a pretty low point. So they thought that creating a committee might help in terms of the relationship between the two. In my experience, that committee, people have been appointed to that committee, but I don't believe that committee has ever met in my 6 years.
So the finance committee, the council vote on the budget. Like 3 months goes by, can they open that budget back up and take money out of there and give it to another time?
They can. I can open up, I can ask for a supplemental appropriation. So unlike, town meeting, where once you vote your budget, pretty much 9 times out of 10, that's your budget. I can, depending on our revenues, if we exceed our revenue projections, I can go back to the council and ask them for additional funding, for more staff. I can ask, I can ask to spend that money. I'm the only one, the town manager is the only one that can propose additional spending, so the council can't on its own propose additional spending. We've never had a case where that's been an issue. And honestly, I don't believe I've ever gone to the council looking for additional, for instance, an additional position, something that would be a recurring expense every year, because we tend to be fairly conservative in that respect. If we have extra revenues or increased revenues, I'll go back to the council and I might ask for, a software purchase that we hadn't anticipated when we were doing the budget or something along those lines. So,
And is it 7 counselors?
there are 9 counselors. And as long as nobody from Bridgewater is listening, I could probably tell you that's 7 might be a better number. We have 7 precincts.
Yeah.
So there are 7 precincts, precinct counselors, and then 2 at-large counselors. Those are all elected, yeah.
2 years?
We have 3 years. We maintain our elections in April, very similar to you, I'm sure. Your elections are probably in the spring. When the charter was developed, the Charter Commission at the time started thinking along the lines of 2-year terms that tracked, the November elections. We're a regional school district where our partner is Rainham, and Rainham is a town meeting form of government. So it was going to be very difficult, and we jointly elect school committee members. So we were going to have a very difficult time trying to have an election in November for counselors, and then another election in April for school committee members. So they just made the decision to stick with April elections, which has been fine. But it's 3-year terms. 3 of them are up every year.
Do the department heads, when they get their budget set, do they go in front of the town manager, or can they go in front of the council?
Good question. Department heads, I work obviously closely with the department heads to develop the budget and on a spending plan for the upcoming year. So once the budget is passed, and as I said, I've been very lucky. You know, we've never had a case where department heads have balked. You know, it may take a while, but we walk them through that process. The council, it's built into the charter, or into the rules and procedure, I can't remember which document, that they really don't have the ability to interact with the department heads on town business matters. So they have to go through me. So, and the same is true, the flip side is true. Town department heads can't go to the council on their
On
own.
the agenda?
They can ask me. I'm sounding maniacal.
Do you have, like the finance and talk about capital? Do they go to the department to look what they need, or do they just go to the capital and say what they want?
So there are occasions, so because of the change in government and because of the way things used to be, when I came in, I had the opportunity to be very strict about separating the council from the department heads, because that was, at the time, that was important for a number of reasons. And so now we're in a place where I think people have gotten used to the form of government, so they understand their roles and responsibilities a little bit better than they did. So that last year, the year before last, and last year and this year, we'll invite the department heads in to explain, their spending plans that we've already worked on directly to, directly to the finance committee. And on occasion, they'll go to the budget and finance committee, but they won't go to the full council. Once the budget gets to them, that's my budget. I have to take ownership of it, and I have to defend it. So then it's my job to do that.
Do they have a 5-year plan, capital plan, or
We do now.
you do not?
Yeah, we didn't, 6 years ago, we had nothing. We just, we're winging it. We didn't have any money to spend anything anyway, so we were winging it. So we're in much better shape now, knock on wood. So we have a 10-year capital plan, we have 20-year projections, and obviously we just focus on the closest 5 years.
Now, do you guys have a problem? With councilmen, do they argue about government, like, right now the town, they always argue about schools and, town hall, municipality, and it's crazy. I know if you guys had the same type of problem.
I think every, those are big, either capital items or big spending items. So, I think every town's going to have a debate, and that's healthy. There's nothing wrong certainly having that debate or those kinds of debates. And, we have it too. We just, a couple of Saturdays ago, approved a $81 million debt exclusion for a new elementary school. And that was, I was actually quite pleased. That's the first time we've had that size of debt exclusion, and I was quite pleased with the, how the council walked through that process, and, how they empowered the building committee to really take charge. But I think overall those are good, in the right forum and structured properly, those are great debates to have. I think the challenge for a lot of towns is how do you structure that debate in such a way as you're getting, that it doesn't become acrimonious and personal, it becomes
You need a
helpful.
strong building committee.
Yeah, and I think
That's true.
you need, Bill probably tell you the same thing. It's the nice, that what I like about our form of government is it creates a structure. And I know some people don't like that structure, and I completely understand why. I don't debate that at all. From where I sit, it's an efficient structure that works as long as you have the right people in place that have, a mature outlook about it that can sort of shape those kinds of debates.
You're a strong town manager. You just- the
I am.
council-
I never say that. But I am.
Laura, was the intent of this agenda item to go deep down one and then deep down the other, or overview of both and then?
I think we can kind of play it by ear, whatever the commission's preference is. There was nothing really set. We weren't exactly sure how they were going to present, whether they had something formal. Sure.
Now that you have changed the form of government, or the board has, town council, you get much public participation in any of the meetings, and if so, when does that tend to happen?
Based on, overall, not enough. And I think that's true across the board, I think. We struggle, just like a lot of towns, we struggle to find, qualified volunteers to fill board and committee seats. In terms of attendance at meetings, it depends on the issue. We went through, marijuana, recreational marijuana, medical marijuana, that drew out a lot of people. And so it depends on the issue, really. But honestly, once you get to the council, once an issue gets to a vote at the council, if we do our jobs right, it's been vetted, through the subcommittee, or through the committees, and through the hearing process, or through the planning board, or through, the budget and finance committee, or, so it's had a lot of vetting. But that doesn't necessarily, we do have public hearings at the council level. And on occasion, people will turn out, depending on the issue.
Okay, since we do seem to be kind of drilling down into some of the more specifics, why don't we let Mr. Keegan give us a little bit of background on his role within Foxborough and maybe even Dedham, and then we can kind of hit them individually as needed, or ask them for just their opinions on general questions having to do with charter specifics or how the practicality of government works.
Michael's just long-winded, that's all.
Only when I'm not in Bridgewater.
No, Mike's actually a very good friend, so we can joke with each other all the time. So good evening, and thank you for having both of us here tonight. I've actually served in municipal government for about 36 years now. And quite honestly, this is probably the most interesting time that I've ever worked in government, where things seem to be changing so quickly, and the people have lots of opinions, and people throw out things that aren't true, and say things that come to mind, and create controversy when there isn't any. But I give you a lot of credit for delving into this, because it's really important that you have a good structure in government. Mike mentioned the fact that I've been on the form of government committee. I've been on the form of government probably about 25 years, and I've served 2 terms as chairman. Mike serving his first, and is doing a great job in doing that. So what I've learned over the years is that if you're looking for a charter, it's really unique to what you want and how you want your community to run. And what's the uniqueness part about Massachusetts, is that Massachusetts allows you that ability to do pretty much how you run a community, how you want to run it. The form that Michael was talking about has actually become a lot more common in more recent years. Randolph went in that direction. Recently, North Attleboro went in that direction. And of course, Bridgewater. Franklin has probably been in that direction for probably the longest in terms of a town. Of course, you have other Plan E forms. City of Lowell, City of Worcester have the council manager form. You also have, in Fall River, you have a city administrator, but has really no authority other than that which delegated to him or her by the mayor. So it's all different forms. I can tell you that throughout the course of my career, I probably worked in all the forms. I actually worked in Florida at one point for a city council, and I worked for the city of Hollywood, Florida, as the HR director. So I was able to really see how that form works with a full mayor and a city council. And I've come back to Massachusetts and served as a manager and an administrator, and worked for a manager in a strong manager form and in a weaker manager form as well. So I'm not a big fan of open town meeting, I will tell you that. That I've worked under it in a couple of occasions. I think it just lends itself to being run by groups that are special interest, as opposed to what's good for the whole. And I think that tends to be the case wherever you go. And I think that's something that's not the best way to run. In our case, it's an $80 million operation. So I think what you want to do is have balance, and that's what you look for in having a good structure. Foxborough's charter has been in place since about 2004, and then and I think it's 2004. And I'm actually the third manager who's worked under that role. The first was an administrator who then was who was then ordained the manager after the charter was changed, and unfortunately didn't really exercise a lot of the authority that was vested into the role. So he didn't stay there very much longer after that change occurred. The next manager came in, was there for just a couple of years, and the fit didn't work. Took a very strong authoritative position using the manager role, and unfortunately it didn't last. And the relationship fell apart rather quickly, actually. So I'm the last person in that role, and following that transition, I'm now in my 6th year as manager of the town. And we've done a lot of good things. In fact, I find that the charter works best when you do a good job of relationship building, working with the different committees and working with the outside entities, developing those relationships, and making things work. Not necessarily because it's written in the word, but more or less because you've been able to absorb the authority that people want to give you. So, and understanding the limits of that. Foxborough's charter is I don't think it's the best written charter that I've seen. And in fact, I think it's probably due for an upgrade as well, for a change as well. The thing I fear about the most, though, is that I think what Mike talked about earlier is something that's really important that I recommend to any community now, is that once you make the charter changes, that you have an educational series with everybody so they fully understand what those changes mean. That never happened in Foxborough, near as I can tell, because there were still debates going on about what certain pieces of the charter say. And unfortunately, there were still elements in the community that were opposed to the charter, and they still debate those issues constantly with the community. Yet the charter passed in Foxborough by a very large margin. So there is a very strong support for the charter that's there, but there is still an element that never was in favor of the charter, and as a result, there's that debate that goes on. So what I can provide for you is the experiences I've had in several communities, as well as I've worked with other communities. I worked with North Attleboro when they developed their charter change for the council manager form, and I've worked with several other communities as well, helping them to try and determine which direction they wanted to go in. Here you have a charter, which is really important because now you have a document you can work from. But then it's important to understand which direction you want to go and what you really hope to achieve from that charter change, and what things are causing you the most angst at this point, which things are working well. So make those lists, establish those lists, and then focus on and pick them off one by one as to which things you can get done, which you think can get done, or which things you think will be the most challenging getting approval from the populace. So I'm here more to provide you a bit of help and a sounding board for some of the things that work well and some of the things that don't work well. And I'll be as honest as I can with you in that process. One of the things that I don't think works well in Foxborough is the budget process, because it's confused. We don't have what is known as a finance committee. We have what is known as an advisory committee. So and they serve as the advisory committee to town meeting. So what's happened is that I think in many cases they have inserted themselves into certain situations which I think go well beyond what was the intent of what their authority was, but there's nothing really that clearly defines that. So it makes it difficult for them to understand their role, and it's difficult for me to try and explain it to them, because it's nothing really that's there to do that. The second thing is that it's unclear as to, I think the intent was that the manager was supposed to present the budget. When I read it, when town council reads it, we both read it the same way. Unfortunately, the town moderator reads it differently. So there's a bit of a, that debate that goes on about who does what. So I have been able to successfully get several budgets done by virtue of the fact there's sort of a compromise as to how we get it done. But what happens typically is that I prepare a budget, I make the request of the various department heads, I review the document, make my recommendations, and then I present that budget to the Board of Selectmen. Board of Selectmen has not made many changes at all to my budget documents in the past 6 years. Though we've had some debates from time to time about how things go. But what's happened is that it then goes to the advisory committee, and the advisory committee then goes through it with a fine-tooth comb. And then what they can do is actually recommend a different budget at the town meeting than what the Board of Selectmen's budget would be. So it gets interesting. But this happened in the past year, and it was actually quite interesting. In 36 years, I've never had a different recommendation from the advisory committee versus the town manager of the Board of Selectmen happen this year, and it got ugly. So it was unfortunate that's the way that happened, but that's what happens when you don't have clear direction established in your charter as to who does what. So I think that's my advice to any committee when you do this, is to be clear about what the language says. And Lauren Goldberg's, I think your counsel in this case, she does a very good job of that. So I'm sure she'll do a good job in helping you try to define that language. Indebtment was actually a much cleaner process, but that was also a representative form of government, representative town meeting. So I had a very good working relationship with the representative town meeting, with the finance committee. It was a very rigorous process. We went through, a very detailed analysis of our recommendations. But in the end, the 12 years, I think there was only 1 year there was one minor change in the budget recommendations that we made. And it was one that I actually supported in the end as well, so it wasn't anything that was controversial. So I can tell you that when you have that good working relationship, it works out well. So, and believe me, I'm a relationship builder. I'm not one that tries to create controversy. But sometimes when you have that element that isn't really supportive of what the form of government is, that can be very destructive. And you have to be very, very careful that you make sure that there is agreement on where the government should go. So that's the challenge I face in the organization I'm in now. But I will tell you that we've made a lot of progress, and we've changed the approach a lot to be more respectful of each other's ideas and ideas and concepts. And it seems to be working. We've made a lot of changes in the communication style, and we're making some good progress. So I'm optimistic this will be a different year than it was last year.
How was your FinCom/advisory committee? Is it appointed by the moderator?
Appointed by the moderator, yeah. So, I will honestly tell you, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Because to have one person control all those appointments, and especially where that person doesn't even believe in the charter, is dangerous. And because you know who gets appointed to the committee, people who don't support necessarily the government, and that's not a good thing. So, fortunately, there's been a couple of people that have really helped along the way, and they've seen through that. But I honestly think that there should be a different way, though, that the advisory committee gets appointed, and it shouldn't be just rested on one person, because in theory, the moderator could have more authority than I do. And I don't think that was ever the intent when they put together the charter. So that's something to think about. I don't know what that answer is. Maybe it's the selectmen appoint a few, school committee appoints a few, maybe the moderator appoints a few, and so it kind of breaks it up a little bit so that it's not all vested into one individual.
I apologize if I missed it.
No.
Or mentioned it earlier, but so Foxborough is currently town meeting,
It's open town meeting.
and what was it before that people are resistant to the town meeting?
Well, I think it was going from the town manager form, from a town administrator form to town manager form, And they also had 3-member Board of Selectmen, they went to a 5-person board. All right, so, and I think what they've resisted is the fact that they don't want the authority to create the budget and to do the appointments vested in the town manager. They want the selectmen to do all of that. There's an element of the community that doesn't like that.
Yeah,
But the vast majority do support it. So that's what you have to work with, but you still have that little bit of a rub. So. And here's the interesting thing about all of that. We're as fiscally stable as any community you're ever going to go to. We're AAA rated. We've got a very good stream of income coming in. We have Gillette Stadium. And we also have a good amount of growth that happens every year because we have development along Route 1.
Any tickets?
No. I don't get free tickets, trust me when I tell you.
That's what happens when you find Bob the crap.
That's right. So, but I will tell you that, that it's a community that has, revenue is not an issue. It's really not an issue. And the biggest challenge I face now is that folks think that we just spend too much, and yet we have stabilization funds, and we've got all kinds of funds set aside, to the point where we built a new town hall and a new school this past year without going to a debt exclusion. We built it within the levy. So, so you just, so we're not fiscally unstable in any way, shape, or form. But unfortunately, there is an element that's just very conservative. And our tax rates, by the way, are very competitive. We are the 18 communities in the region. We're right in the middle. We're not on the high end. We're not on the low end. We're right in the middle. So it's really it's interesting to me to see how that situation has evolved into the way it is, and how people think that way. But I think there's an element in the community that, just like there is every place you go, where people think that taxes are too high, and that and they just want to keep them low. We all do. I mean, I'm a taxpayer too, just like everybody else is. But the reality is that the cost of operation continue to go up. I mean, everybody's household costs continue to go up, and then people are still faced with those same kind of struggles.
You had mentioned that you weren't a fan of open town meeting specifically due to special interest groups. I'm wondering what your thoughts are with regards to the ability to react, I guess, in a timely manner with having biannual town meetings, having represented 2 towns that have town meeting form of government, and then having come from a city councilor form that may meet and may be more limber with regards to getting things done. And what's your opinion on, is it effective or efficient for this day and age?
Well, I think what's happened, first, the open town meeting is the purest form of government in New England, and we're probably one of the few places in the country that does that. If you go across the country, a lot of towns and cities have gone to the manager form of government, council manager form, because it's just a better way to run a multi-million-dollar organization. It's purest form of government and democracy, and I can tell you that I doubt very much that Foxborough will change from it anytime soon, because they feel very strongly about that. So I recognize that. I just have to work within that structure. So and I will continue to work within that structure. So that's not the issue for me. I'm not sure it's the most efficient way to do it, though, because it's always best when you're working with a group that understands the issues, that understands the impact of the entire aspect of what you're doing, and how all the pieces have to fit together. Whether it's a school issue, a town issue, a public works issue, a public safety issue, you have to be in a position so that you know how those pieces all fit together. And it's not one versus the other. We're all one team, so to speak.
Just a question. So we're clearly not the first group to go down a path reviewing something like this, right? The fact that your group exists to advise people like us is a sign of that. So as you've seen this in other areas, are there any parts of a charter that you would consider to be sort of solved problems, that there's just a way to do a certain part of it that it's a no-brainer, and here's the thing to do, just go down that path?
Dang, the hard question comes along and I get it.
I'll give it just a little bit. So I'll help you with that.
All right, prop me up. I think, unfortunately, the answer probably is every community is different, and every community gets to make their own decisions.
Yep.
And as Bill pointed out, there are multiple different forms of government in Massachusetts, and you can pretty much shape it and do with it whatever you want, whatever this community, the voters in this community want to do with it. Having said that, I think I would echo what Bill said. You know, if I were to pick out anything that's sort of, you know, this is the way you should do it, I would say, you know, streamlining the financial piece of it. And I can tell you, our charter is terrible. At least the piece the financial piece, it really needs to be rewritten. But it's understandable that it's awful because it was written by people, citizens, who didn't understand municipal
All the
finance.
pieces of it,
And when Bill talks about open town meeting and having a difficulty, you know, trying to explain to people how a piece of a financial piece fits into the whole, that's a really hard thing for the average citizen to wrap their head around. Nobody, you know, in 1650, you know, town meeting was a whole lot easier than it is in 2019. And so whatever we can do to make it very clear how the financial process works within a charter is probably the only thing that I can really think of. Just creating the structure within which you can have all the debate you want in the world, but just creating that structure so that there's clear lines of authority and clear lines of responsibility is probably the most important thing.
Thank you.
I'll try and be a little bit more specific from my end, and in my experiences and what I've seen is that, first of all, I think it should be clear that the manager appoints all the department heads and the employees, because if you have a situation where you have different people appointing people, you create divisions and lines of authority that are confused. And so, I think that really, as an organization, really should be under one person to make that decision, to run the organization on a day-to-day basis. However, as far, and I agree with Mike 100% that you should have a clear and that there should be a clear line of response when it comes to the budget stuff, because, and the finances, because, you know, we're talking millions and millions of dollars here, and if mistakes get made, it can be really impactful to a community in a negative way. So we really have to, there has to be a clear line of authority. So when the two strong pieces, clear budget process, clear budget authority, and then clear appointment authority. In my community, Mike appoints just about all the committees and the employees, but in my community, the selectmen appoint the committees, I appoint the employees. And that's okay with me, I'm fine with that. I mean, because in the end, if the board wants to have certain people serve on committees, it's fine with me, I'll work with them, that's not an issue for me. But in terms of having the authority for appointing the employees, that's important, because it has to be one clear message in terms of how we're going to run the operation.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Did I read it correctly in your bylaws that the Water Sewer Board appoints the superintendent? Is that?
Actually, no, I actually appoint the director. There's one Public Works Director.
Okay.
All right, and the Public Works Director I appoint him. And the Superintendent of Water and Sewer is appointed by the DPW Director.
Okay.
Right.
And do you think that works well, or?
It works well because he's the division head of the department head. So, and I will tell you, the way it works in practice is that he's not going to appoint anybody unless he talks to me first. And because we have a team atmosphere which we developed over time, and the reason why we do that is so that we're clear about how the organization is going to run, and we want it to run a certain way, and there has to be a person that fits into that organization well.
I'd only add to what Bill said that I don't know how many people in the room own or run businesses that employ people, but the liability that comes along with being an employer, and hiring people properly and disciplining people properly and terminating people properly is so critical. I mean, Lauren will tell you, you know, that 95% of litigation involved in municipalities revolves around HR issues.
right.
So the more
Absolutely true.
the more
Absolutely true.
more effort you put into how you hire, and the more streamlined and efficient and structured you make that, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, I couldn't say that even stronger. I will tell you that you're better off to spend more time in making a good decision on the front end as opposed to spending all the time on the back end defending that situation because you hired the wrong person. Can't say, I couldn't emphasize that more.
Where does the authority with you guys with, like, contract negotiations with individual unions and whatnot?
So, in Foxborough, I am the negotiating authority for the town, but in the end, the selectmen approve all the contracts. So there's a check and balance in that, and I think that's okay. I'm really okay with that. And you know, quite honestly, the board doesn't really get too involved in the negotiation piece. They sort of let me run it, and I report back to them periodically as to how things are going. And in the end, if there's a huge problem, if there's a real difference of opinion, we figure that out and we get it done. But it's usually a clear strategy before we walk in to negotiations.
Same with us.
The town council approves it for you guys.
Town council ratifies the contract, but it's one that I negotiate, or we have a negotiating team
Right.
ratify it, and then the council ratifies.
Who's part of that, like, negotiating team?
For the most part, the way I've set it up, and it's not anything that's set by charter or by ordinance, but it's usually me, the assistant town manager, and the finance director. And then that, you know, that's actually helpful. We usually, up until now, we've kept the department head out of it. Our department heads are all represented by another union, most of them are. So it makes it awkward if they're involved in other bargaining unit negotiations. So that's just the way it is. But I have negotiated with department heads in a prior life, so you could do that either way.
The DPW, you have a DPW. How do they, does everybody work together, like water, highway, tree department, cemetery?
Yeah, under one roof.
One roof. So do they all work together?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when it comes to plowing, they all plow. They, you know, and they help each other out all the time. If we have a major situation or, you know, emergency response, they're all helping each other out. It's probably one of the more efficient operations I've ever seen.
I know Roger,
Yeah,
very nice guy.
retiring in December.
I know.
It's unfortunate, but he's a great guy. Roger's a great guy.
So that works for you?
It does, it works really
We
well.
don't have a DPW there. We got everything separate.
Yeah, and-
The water, the highway, cemetery, and tree, they're all the same, and the water's their own entity.
The more you can try and shrink your organizations into bigger groups, but fewer lines of authority, the better it is, because I just think it creates a bigger team atmosphere for everybody when you do that. And stuff gets done, we don't run into these invisible lines, if you will, about, oh, that's not really my area, that's theirs, and you just want to avoid that if you can.
Do you have a director? You have two superintendents?
We have a superintendent for water, we have a superintendent or we have general foreman for the highway piece, and general foreman for the parks, parks maintenance, and then and the superintendent for water and sewer. And then we have a town engineer as well.
You do?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. It's a good operation.
Yeah, sounds good.
The engineer, is he the head of the DPW?
No, we have the DPW director, happens to be an engineer, Roger Hill is an engineer as well, but we have a town engineer that's separate, and the town engineer in our town basically runs a lot of the major construction projects for us, for a lot of infrastructure and road improvements. He's a guy in the field that handles a lot of that stuff and makes sure it gets done
How
right.
about the stormwater? Is he involved in that?
He does the stormwater as well,
Does he?
yeah. So,
Does he need a job?
I'll tell you, he's got a full plate right now. He really does. And not only that, he's likely a candidate for the DPW's director's job too, so. Good guy.
Mr. Dutton, does Bridgewater also have a DPW?
Bridgewater has created DPW as part of the administrative code, which was the sort of, after the charter was voted, there was a long period, well, significant number of years where there was a lot of floundering and nobody knew what to do next. And what they should have done is made sure that there was a draft administrative code to follow up the charter adoption. The administrative code sort of spells out what your committee structure is, you know, how many committees you're going to have, who's going to be on them, you know, just a lot of that detail. It also fleshes out the structure of your operational side. I'm always very clear that, you know, there's the operational side and the political side. So the committee, board, council, that's all the political side. You know, the operational side is where stuff actually gets done. No, I didn't mean it that way.
Yes, you did.
I sort of did. So when we created the administrative code, we basically condensed all the finance offices into a finance department. We took all of the highway, water, sewer, all the same things. We collapsed that into a DPW, and then sort of the community service pieces, the library, the Council on Aging, Veteran Services, and so forth. We sort of created a division. We recognized that those functions didn't necessarily have similarities, but they sort of had a public service component. So we sort of collapsed those, not, you know, in name, I guess is the best way to put it. So we spent the last probably four years really putting a lot of focus on our finances because, as I mentioned, we were in really sad straits. And, you know, you really can't do anything unless you've got your finances straight. So we put a lot of focus and effort on our finance areas, and that now works. That is a true finance department. We have now have a town engineer, we have a water and sewer superintendent, and we've got a highway superintendent. And they do work together very well. But sort of our next focus probably over the next 3 or 4 years is to really create that true DPW. It exists in name, but we'll be in a position now to be able to afford to actually hire a true DPW director who will be tasked with really creating a true DPW. So we have, I guess the best way to put it is we got those departments, they work very well together, but it's not a true DPW just yet.
Can I ask a question about your administrative code? I saw that it's mentioned within your charter. Is it considered part of the charter, or is it a separate, I guess under state regs, is it a separate document? Or if you would amend it, is it as same as having to amend a charter?
No, good question. The charter is, you know, charter's our constitution, and that, you know, that's same as anywhere. That's much more difficult for us to amend. So the administrative code is effectively an ordinance. So it's like equivalent of a bylaw. So it's much easier to amend the administrative code. So we haven't, you know, having said that, we haven't, with very few exceptions, we haven't really amended the administrative code yet. It was, I think part of that is it was so long in coming, and it went through such a process to actually get voted by the council that I think people just want to leave it be for a little while. So it's the administrative code. The way I explain it is we have a town code, and it includes all of our governing documents. A lot of which are still in process. You know, we've got a lot of work to do to really flesh out our town code, but it includes the town charter, includes the administrative code, it includes personnel code, includes, you know, DPW regulations, town manager regulations, health regulations. So it's a one-stop shop for any piece of town rule or regulation or organization that you want to find. It should be in there. I can tell you that, you know, once we finish the administrative code and some of the other pieces, you know, we kind of took a break. We're on a little bit of a hiatus, but we'd have to come back and flesh out a lot of that.
Just a clarifying question. So the town charter does speak to this administrative code, and then you modified it subsequent to coming out of the charter?
So the charter refers to things that are going to be addressed in the administrative code.
Oh, I understand.
So the charter passed, and yes, it referred to the administrative code that didn't exist for a number of years. So we were sort of in the woods for a few years until the administrative code said, okay, these are the committees we're going to have, this is how they're appointed, these are the town departments we're going to have, and this is how they're run. And so now we're in a better place, at least.
So in an ideal world, when the charter was approved, the administrative code would have been written up also?
Would have been, it would have been
Further
prepared in a draft format,
Ideally.
ready to go.
Yeah. And then,
Ideally.
as you mentioned, the transition was very tough.
It was.
And it sounds like that's,
That was part of the reason. There was, I think the people involved didn't really understand what a council manager form of government really was. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion with elected officials. They didn't know what their role was on the council when they got there. So that part didn't bode well.
So probably the most important thing to consider, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is that not only is it important to create a good document, but to make sure that everybody clearly understands it, and then all the pieces that go with it. Like, for instance, I still see bylaws in Foxborough that need to be changed to be reflective of what the charter actually says, because it's still confusing to people as to what, how it actually interacts, and similar to what Michael's situation is in Bridgewater. And so, it's not uncommon. It's like, you folks are all volunteers. I mean, and we do this, we're professional administrators, but by the same token, we don't always write the policy per se. We're not policy makers. We're the people carry it out, make sure it gets done. But then we find these things along the way. We say, geez, we start to do something, all of a sudden we see, oh, what does that mean? Well, how come that doesn't work with this? And so we see these things, and so it's sort of a combination of things that you have to have a good person, a good practitioner, as well as a person who understands the policy piece in developing these documents.
so Bridgewater went straight from a open town meeting.
Went from 0 to 60.
Yeah, so I was curious, so what would you suggest as an intermediary step, I guess you could say?
Again, that's going to be up to you and your voters. You'll know what Norton, what's going to resonate in Norton and what the issues are. I mean, Bill and I don't necessarily know what is prompting a look at your form of government.
I guess I was asking the question more so, like, what's for argument's sake, let's just say we went from open town meeting to representative town meeting.
Right. That's probably the only step you can take.
Yeah, I think.
That I know of, really. So you open to representative to potentially to a council.
Yeah. And
Those are really the three steps.
Right, and I guess, to me at least, going from even a representative to a town council is still going, maybe not 0 to 60, but you're still moving at a pretty fast speed.
Yeah.
It's a big difference.
It is a
That
big
is a
Either
big
one
difference.
is a big leap, I guess, without.
Yeah, and it's a big leap. From my perspective, I think, I think the form that I have creates, a more structure. And again, some communities, that's what they need. Some communities aren't going to go that route because they don't necessarily want more structure. In communities with really active participants on boards and committees, you're probably not going to get to that point. But from an operations standpoint, you can make changes in your charter, to create a more of a pyramid structure. So you've got sort of a leader that's in charge of running the operations day to day, and that's very identified. A lot of what Bill talked about, making sure that the town administrator, the town manager in this case, has hiring authority I think that's probably key. I take my other answer back. I'll agree with Bill about that. That really is key.
But the communities that went to a council manager form, I look in recent years, Randolph, Bridgewater, North Attleboro, those are communities that really had some really difficult political problems and challenges along the way. I mean, North Attleboro has been struggling to try and get a mayor in form form of government for, probably they tried it 5 times in the past 10 years. Finally, they just said, well, we're going to do away with that, we're going to go towards a council manager form. So that remains to see how that's going to work out. I mean, it's still, I mean, that's brand new. I can tell you, Randolph really turned it around. I mean, because they struggled for the longest time trying to figure out which direction they wanted to go, and they couldn't figure out their finances, and there's some real big challenges there. They went to that form, and I can tell you, they've done very well, very well. They still, they still have challenges. I mean, it's the nature of government. It's not everything's perfect, but it's a far better organization than it was several years ago.
I know this is hypothetical, but from you coming from an open town meeting in Oak Bluffs and working with what you work now, and I don't want to put you in the spot, but if Bridgewater ceased to, that job was no longer, would you even consider going to a town with open town meeting?
You must have been listening to me at home. I tell my wife, no way, I couldn't go back. But in fairness, Bill's been through many more town meetings than I have, but I'd been through probably, 15 or 20 over the years, and I was ready to be done. It's it's an interesting community, great community, but very difficult town meetings with a lot of, no holes barred kind of thing. So, but I honestly, government at that point really wasn't I shouldn't say it wasn't my passion, but I had come from, a more corporate world, obviously, and put myself in that position and learned an awful lot, it's a complete shift because you're not, you don't have a reporting structure, that's non-existent, and, my authority as the town administrator was pretty much whatever the Board of Selectmen gave me, and when the board changed, my role and authority changed, so it was very, amorphous, I guess. And when I left there and looked for other options, I even at that point, I was looking for a university or college town that had a different form of government. So I knew before I ever came to Bridgewater, before I ever experienced that form of government, that I was probably done with open town meeting.
I've heard at least one of you say that town council seems to be more efficient, a more efficient way to run a municipality. You've got multi-million-dollar budgets. Do you see many efficiencies moving from OTM to RTM?
Well, I think what happens, here's the issue with OTM versus RTM. OTM, I've seen multiple occasions where people will show up for the first town meeting in their entire life and vote on something they don't even know what they're voting on. Yeah. And I've seen people just vote things down and they don't know why they're voting it down. Right? I've seen people vote things in, they don't know what they're voting in. So that's the challenge. RTM, those people have been through the process, unless it's their first time being elected to the representative position. They're there, meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and they're getting educated how the process works. And they're going to take more time to understand the issues, generally speaking, than an open town meeting person. Now, there are people that go to open town meeting and it's religion to them. There are certain ones that go every single meeting. And God bless them, I'm glad they do it, because we really do need folks to do that. But the other side of that is that my experience in dealing with OTM versus RTM is that the RTM tends to understand the process better and also understands the issues better, just by virtue of the fact that they've done it more often.
And that was part of my question. I just wondered if your actual experience was that they did educate themselves.
They do.
And you would expect that they should.
I mean, let's face it, if you're going to get yourself elected to serve in that role, you're going to take a little bit more initiative and get involved in the issues a little bit more than you would otherwise.
Do you see the special interest issue in the RTM?
You do. But it's more predictable. And it's also one in which, if you see it emerging, you can actually reach out to that group and actually talk to them about, what the pros and cons of their issues are. So it's whereas OTM, you have no idea who's going to show up that night. That's the unpredictable factor. And then, you know, I just think it from a logic perspective. And take it from a person who's doing this for their entire career in government. We're running an $80 million operation for a person that just shows up for one meeting. That's scary. That's really scary. And you know, I love people that take an interest in their government, but do it, if you're gonna do it seriously. Don't just show up for one issue and then leave. Because that to me is problematic for how we manage our governments. And I think we really have to think about that in today's, especially in today's world, because it's much more complicated than it ever was.
You mentioned both the financial recovery in Bridgewater and then Randolph as well. And I don't know if it was coincidence that it was after I went to town council or not, which is, I guess, is my question. So how much of that do you see as the form of government allowed that, or was it just execution? What was it, you? Right. Oh.
It was all me. No, it wasn't me at all. I think a portion of it, prior to my arrival, the council had taken some steps to reverse what was rapid descent into oblivion, and those, was sort of a 3 or 4 point plan that they adopted, and that had begun to change things. So I won't say it necessarily, the recovery had a whole lot to do with the form of government. I think there were some people on the council who understood what had to be done, and they made some really hard choices and hard policy decisions. I think moving forward, I think we've, I tell people it takes, you develop a reputation, and it'll take you 5 years to turn around your finances. It'll take you 10 or 15 years to get your reputation back. We were really lucky. That whole timetable is really accelerated. I don't know about our reputation because I never leave Bridgewater, so I only hear Bridgewater people talking. But but I do think that the form of government has helped us, from that point forward, just because there's a much more efficient budget process, and there's more opportunity for, really people that are well educated on the budget and what we're trying to do at the table. Might be a function of the structure that we have.
Got it. And then I think you also had both mentioned some things around citizen participation in what you were saying. So as we look at it, I think our last town meeting had 140 people or so, which is typical if there's not something regarding taxation on there.
Yeah.
So as you look at the different forms where towns have challenges with turnout day to day, is there one that's better than the other? And then specifically as it relates to RTM, much like your question of the theory versus your observations in practice, to get that many people to run for something, have you observed there being challenges in getting that many people to really step forward?
That can also be. I mean, it wasn't an issue in Dedham.
It wasn't an issue?
It was not in Dedham.
Okay.
Dedham was an RTM. Shrewsbury was an RTM.
Yeah.
Not an issue in either one of those communities that I could see. People actually took pride in doing that.
Yeah.
In North Attleboro, which is an RTM too, by the way, before they went to town council, they got people to run, but they just wouldn't show up for the meeting, which is really strange. I mean, so and the problem was that they would struggle getting enough people to have a quorum, and so when you do that. And this is a world we live in today anyways, by the way. It's really hard to get people to do anything, to run, because everybody's busy. I mean, we get it. We do. You've got two income households, rather, for just about every house in America today. And people are just busy, and it's hard for them to be involved.
Yeah.
But it can be a challenge to get people to run. But, if you're going to go to, there's only really 3 steps. It's OTM, RTM, town council. That's it.
And with the population that you've seen run for RTM, do you feel that they accurately or realistically reflect the demographics of the town, or are younger people more apt to run, or seniors more?
I've actually seen it evolve over time. was an older crowd in Dedham. Now I'm told that it's a younger crowd.
Okay.
So so you're seeing an evolution of that over time. I think it's nice we can have a mix,
Yeah.
quite honestly.
Yeah,
with
a
balance.
representative town meeting, right?
Yeah, it makes for a more balanced town meeting. So, it's really reflective of the reflection of the community. I mean, if your community is starting to turn over, where your older population is moving out or moving into other forms of housing, and then moving out of your community to that situation, and the younger crowds moving in, that's going to be reflective of that as well.
Got it.
Yeah, okay.
Please.
Yeah, I actually had spoken to Mr. Munchbatch from,
Munchback, Paul Munchback, yeah.
yeah, from
Yeah.
Dedham, great guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah,
Paul's a great
really,
guy.
very informed. I think he was the clerk, I believe. I think
Yeah, town clerk.
for like 30
He was a selectman, though, as well.
Oh, was he?
He actually was a selectman who hired me 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, 16 years ago now.
Yeah, so I had spoken to him about it. So he told me that RTM had been in place for at least 60 years, as far as he
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
aware of it. So,
Yeah, he's a
quite
good guy.
interesting. But he did talk a lot about how the participation goes through cycles,
Yeah, it does.
and really was issue-driven. He was
Yeah.
mentioning, like, currently, I think they built a new school, they did, a couple of big projects. And,
Yeah, there's a couple, Dedham really has evolved over the past several years, and what's happened now is that they get locked into certain debates. It's a political community, very political community, I will tell you, because it's Boston, it's edge of Boston, and you get Boston politics that play into that. It's really kind of interesting to see. But my observation of it is that it is a very thoughtful place. People really take their government very seriously, and they become very impassioned about it. And they get locked into certain issues, like they didn't want to have a walkway or a pathway that goes through the town, an old railway, or they're going to try and turn it into a walkway, and they didn't want to do that. But there was another group that wanted it, and so there was really a big, interesting debate going on about that. And then they fight over, they think they're growing too fast, and so now they put a little bit of moratorium on it. So it's kind of interesting how these things evolve over time, but it's a very thoughtful place, and I really, really liked it there when I was there, but it's a very interesting place.
Yeah, I lived in Dedham for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Just I rented a home, but
Yeah.
but you could just walk down to town, the center, and meet
Yep.
people, and and you can't do that really from a practical. No one.
Yeah, I mean, not every town's built that way. They never
Yeah.
really defined downtown, though, in
I
Denver.
wasn't involved in politics in any way, shape, or form, but I can absolutely see where you're going to have those kind of conversations just by walking
Yep.
out your door.
You're absolutely right.
You couldn't walk out your door without seeing somebody.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think Paul had mentioned that there was actually talk of going to a town council up to about 5 years ago, but then a lot of these,
Yeah,
the demographics started to change. And,
Right.
in the town, I guess they built a new town hall, new schools, and actually, the rail line.
yeah, the rail line was the
trail,
big
yeah.
issue, yeah,
And he said that really got, participation was like sky high.
right,
So he actually saw the cycle too,
yeah.
and,
He's still there. He called me because he was disappointed because he wanted me to come back, and I said no.
yeah, yeah.
But that,
Yeah, so I guess I was going with it all was it kind of like the RTM seems to ebb and flow, I guess, depending on
right,
the nature of the town and
Right.
the issues.
interesting.
Yeah, if you have a town that's not all that engaged in politics and you don't have a lot of issues, you're probably gonna have nobody showing up.
Well, this is this area alone, and Mike's probably seen this as well, is that this is sort of a mix between Boston and Providence. And so you've got some really, really passionate issues, and you've got some issues that can be really nasty at times. And it's unfortunate, but because when you see that element come out, then you really, what you really look for is, well, what's the issue, and what can we get to? How can we solve the issue? And sometimes we get too emotional to the point where you can't deal with the issue. You're just dealing with the emotions, and I think that's the biggest challenge we face nowadays. It's been at least our observation.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Just with your involvement with the college in Bridgewater, I mean, obviously we're not a state university here, but we have Wheaton. How did the council switch kind of change the relationship with the college? I mean, because obviously Wheaton's a large portion of our town. It's also pretty much the dead center of our town.
Yeah, that I think it was partly partly elected officials. There were, right before I arrived, there was a recall election, and a couple of the counselors, just the fact there was a recall election after the change in government tells you how rocky a, trip it was. But I think there were a couple of counselors who were pounding away at the notion that, the state didn't pay, anything towards our bottom line, same as Wheaton doesn't pay a property tax. And so though that turned over, but I think in a more general way, since I was the executive authority, all of a sudden, instead of the Board of Selectmen or the committee of the council, it really was me that was the point person in terms of the relationship with the college or with the university. It helped that a couple of years after I arrived, the university president retired, and they chose to elevate the executive vice president, Fred Clark, to the presidency, and Fred and I had a very good relationship. So a lot of it was just the personal rapport, and sort of the sort of the respect that you develop in just that kind of personal rapport. So, it's been a good one. It's borne fruit. We've done a lot of things together. We have a lot of things in the on the planning board, or in front of us to accomplish. And I think we're going to see a lot of good things, with that combination. We both say, the university can only get so good without the town rising to the level, and the town can only get so good without the university rising to the level. So we're sort of codependent in some ways, and so we both know that we can only get so good without making sure that the other one sort of comes along with us.
That's exactly the relationship we have with the Kraft Group at Gillette Stadium. Same thing. We both depend on each other for our success. If they want to continue to develop around the stadium, that only helps us financially. But yet, they need our help in order to make certain things happen, whether it's zoning or it's infrastructure or whatever the case may be. We have to work together to make that happen. And so we found during the past several years that the more we've done that, both organizations have actually really benefited by that.
If you don't mind, Mr. Dutton, you had mentioned recall specifically, and I was hoping to address, I guess, trends or rationale with regards to citizen participation regarding petitions, initiatives, referendums, recall. From what we've read, if I'm not mistaken, it looks like for a citizen initiative within Bridgewater, the citizens have 10 days to come up with 10% of the voting population in order to get a measure considered. And then subsequent to that, you need 20% to actually vote it in if town council decides to put it up for a vote. It seems, I understand the reason for the time frame, and the percentage doesn't necessarily seem high until you look at the actual numbers and how difficult that is in practicality to accumulate the many signatures. And I'm struggling with how do you balance? So right now we have open town meeting. If we want to get a special town meeting, we literally need 200 signatures on a ballot, and we get a special town meeting with a warrant article. How do you balance the not being so high as to be insurmountable, but to avoid frivolous measures taking place? And I actually would appreciate both of your feedback on that.
That's probably the crux of the conversations that are very difficult. There were parts of our charter that were that were crafted to encourage citizen participation, and that was done, as I mentioned earlier, as what I think was sort of the grand compromise. Here's the new form of government we all want to go to, but we realize people are going to say, hey, what about town meeting? I don't get to go voice myself at town meeting. Or, hey, what about the ability to overturn a decision that we don't like? We need to get so many signatures. So I think there are a lot of pieces of the charter that sort of speak to that. We actually, by charter, require I think it's two, and we call them town meetings, but they're not decision-making bodies. They're not a legislative body, but they're gatherings of citizens that choose to show up, and they actually provide subject matter to talk about. And I can tell you, the first couple of meetings that we held, there were people that submitted, topics that they wanted to discuss, and eventually the participation in those dropped off. And I don't know, the last one we scheduled was a couple of years ago, even though it's required by charter, and I don't think anybody showed up. So that was, and that's disheartening, because there are a lot of issues that people talk about. I think, without being sure, but I think that the discussion about all those topics happens on Facebook. And since it happens on Facebook, you don't have to go somewhere to talk about that. So that's a whole nother issue, and how government generally is going to have to adapt. But I think that's, you sort of hit the nail on the head. If you're going to move to the type of government that we have, how do you do that and ensure that citizens have some role and some way to participate in that form? Unfortunately, ours, I think the first real citizen participation was a recall election, which is not, optimal. You don't
Were
wanna
they
advertise
successful?
that. Yes. Yeah, they recalled, the voters recalled two counselors and elected two new counselors. And that was back in probably a year, I want to say it was a year or two after the form of government changed. So I don't think there's a magic number there. I think it's just a lot depends on historical, what the historical citizen participation is in the community, and what's going to satisfy the public at large in terms of percentages.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I
Yes.
just wondered, you were talking about the importance of making your policies, your financial policies clear in the charter. Do you have any specific examples of charters that do that well?
I can probably get you some. I think that the Shrewsbury Charter is probably is a good one. I think Holden has a good charter as well, and that's in terms of town manager forms. There's another. Lauren's probably a good resource for that too. But there's several out there that we can point to, and we'll try and get you some direction on that. But it's really it's the most critical piece, I think. It's more on the budget piece more than it is anything, as opposed to the financial policies. And from a good budget process will yield sound financial policies. And you want to have sound financial policies that you follow and you point to and use them on a regular basis, especially in developing your budget.
Any other questions? Gentlemen, sir,
I said I don't think so.
you're all set? Gentlemen, we very much thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Happy to
you
be
very
here.
much.
Very much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Thank you.
If you have further questions, feel free to ask and reach out to us. We'll be happy to help.
We may take you up on that. We would appreciate that. Thank you very
Do that.
much.
I'll see if I can get you some examples of that.
Thank you.
Okay?
Hopefully the rain stopped.
I know. That ain't working, right? So Lauren's been around. She knows charters as good as anybody. You're a good man.
Thank you.
That doesn't be away from North Mass. Hey, Bill. Hey, Bill, I had to talk for a couple of times. Right, Bill?
Good evening. How'd it go?
Pretty sure I was that one day.
They're still playing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Third one at the half, so that's good.
You were winning, though?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We're sorry to take you away from that.
That's okay. I feel like the best thing of the night, though, was they tweeted that someone tried to score a goal and it was blocked by Goldberg's head, which is my son. I was like, well, that's pretty funny to read on Twitter. Anyway. Thank you for giving me a little extra time.
No. It actually worked out just about perfectly, so.
Excellent.
Yes, thank you very much. Everybody knows this is Lauren Goldberg. She was with us in our very first meeting, acting as town council, and hopefully here to give us a little bit more guidance on some questions, some of which we had provided to her in advance, just so she had an idea, which she very kindly had responded to, which is good because it may result in some follow-up questions. But I think what we'll do is, I put an outline together, kind of going in order of the sections and articles of the charters that we've read so far. We'll sort of take them in order. Obviously, there may be some jumping around. But with regards to powers of the town and corporations, scope of power, form of government, specifically as the charters are written, did anybody have any specific questions within that category?
Did you hand out copies of the responses? I know they got emailed.
I have some, yes. I did not, well, I emailed them, but somebody didn't have them, but I do have does anybody else need a copy?
I'll take one if you have one.
Sure.
I'll let it read off my phone.
There you go. There's one.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I wasn't expecting a heck of a lot of questions within that area. So one of the things that we had asked was the composition of town council, specifically in addressing the pros and cons of having a body elected entirely at large, or by precinct, or a mix thereof. And Lauren had provided some very good feedback specific to that, and I didn't know if anybody had any follow-up questions to what was there. Okay. Yes.
Madam Chair, if I can offer you just a little anecdotal information, which is that the city of Lowell was just at their November 5th election. They had to deal with trying to pick a new way to pick out their council. They had all at-large council, I mean, they had at-large and district councilors, but the district councilors were voted by the full city. And so it was determined that wasn't an appropriate way for them to select their councilors. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that the balance between district and at-large, the reason, and I had written about this in the response I gave you, but the reason that there typically are district councilors is to deal with district-related issues. If everyone gets to vote for a district councilor, then really they're just being elected because they're on the ballot because they happen to live there, but they're not necessarily being chosen by the voters of the district. So it's something to keep in mind.
Okay. Any follow-up questions to that? Then there was the question with benefits or pitfalls of having a town council president being separately elected. And I had a sort of follow-up, and hadn't considered it, but I guess it would stand that if you were running specifically for town council president, it would have to be an at-large position.
Correct.
So thereby, you would need to have at least one at-large, even if you decided to go with strictly precinct.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is, if all the councilors are elected at large, then, and they're all elected at the same time, as they are in many cities, so it's like every 2 years, all of them are elected at once. And so it's vote for 9, or vote for 13, or vote for 11, whatever it is. It's one office, and you go through and you pick the slate of people that you want to elect. In that kind of a situation, you'd have to have a separate office. So maybe if it's 11-member council, you'd have 10 at large, and then one person who's running for or one office that's running for the council president office. So it's a different position under those circumstances versus the position that you say, of the at-large councilors, the person who gets the most votes is actually the president. If it's all district councilors and just the person who gets the most votes is the council president. And the North Attleboro Charter Commission really struggled with that. It may be helpful, I'm pretty sure they have their materials online still, but maybe watching a little of their debate might be useful. I think they were very concerned about the idea that the public was going to lose access to picking the chief executive, essentially. And so they really, I mean, it's not exactly a mayor in North Attleboro, but it's kind of a position that straddles both executive and legislative functions, which it has to, because that's the way that the law works. But they wound up, their compromise was to say that it was up to the council. I think they wound up saying it was up to the council to make the decision. But double check that. But it was I know it was a good discussion.
Yeah.
What happens in a case of, like, for instance, if you have a town that's precincts aren't formed in a way that allows for that type of election to take place? Like, for instance, if we have 5 precincts here, do you have to, like, how does a charter, if we were to switch the charter, change the charter to that, who goes about making sure that those are in line with being able to, elect precinct councilman or councilwoman?
Well, I think one of the concerns about doing the precincts that are different, or districts that are different than precincts, is that it's very hard for people to keep track of who they get to vote for and how. So that's something to think about. Also, when you print the ballots, you print them essentially by precinct. That's how, so if you had a split precinct, you'd only have a split precinct for your local election. So it'd be like precinct 1 and precinct 1A. If you were trying to make it so that it was a different configuration. And that can be really hard to deal with.
Like, how do you see it, like, with a town that's more rural, like, for instance, Norton, very spread out, longer streets, they're not, like, distinct. I mean, even though we have distinct villages, or we had a distinct villages a long time ago, we don't have that ability to say, okay, well, this is the small east side of town where a bunch of people live, and that's a precinct, you know what I mean? We do it very different. You can be part of precinct 1 and be very spread out. From me living in precinct 1. Do most towns say, we're not gonna do it that way, and we're gonna go with council ash because of that issue? Or do they try to rezone where the actual districts or precincts are?
I don't think most communities deal with the precincts. They build their council makeup based on existing precincts or the potential for another one. So that may be, for example, let's say you decided we are in favor of a 9-member council, and that's, 1 person from every district and 4 at large. But then if we have another precinct, then it would be 3 at large. So they adjust that based on that. The precincting process is very extensive, and it's regulated very carefully by the state government. So every 10 years or so, when there's a census, that information is given to the cities and towns, and they have to decide whether they need to redraw their precinct lines. Secretary Galvin's office is the entity that really oversees that. John Barr is the name of the person that helps with the census, and so they will use their mapping. They have special mapping programs to help figure out how the precincts should be set up. And basically, one of the major rules is you want to have about as many people in each precinct. The precincts have to be contiguous, to avoid situations where you give this group of people a voting block versus this group. So that happens at that level, and there's nothing that you all need to do about it, which is very convenient. I think in Lowell, their feeling was that it wasn't winding up and electing people in a fair manner. I don't think that would be something that you guys would run into. It's just the district representation, again, it's kind of a balance with, is there a person there that you're voting for that's representing your interests, your area's interests? If, in Needham, for example, I don't think there'd be any need for precinct representation because the town just isn't that big. We don't have established villages. But then you look at something like Newton, or Newton has a bunch of different villages. Brookline, which is a town, has a bunch of different areas, and they're very distinct from one another. And so what might be really important to the people in one area might not matter at all to the people in another area. In my town, as I said, I'm from Needham, there's really nothing like that. People might be worried about school traffic, or they might be worried about the light signaling, in a certain area, but it's mostly everybody's gonna be affected by it, so.
So if I heard you correctly, so adjusting precincts is not something that we would do. We would work within the precincts that we have
Yes,
if we were to.
that would be the easiest.
Okay.
What I was saying about sub-precincts is that, so at the federal level, that's why you have precincts, is because you vote for, Senate and the House of Representatives. So House of Representatives is based on the number of people. So each of those districts is set up based on precincts. So it's a census block, and then a precinct, and then a town. So wards in cities as well. And so if you don't use that setup for the election of local officials, you have to create sub-precincts. So because you need to print a different ballot for the other precincts, essentially, because if part of precinct 1 and part of precinct 2 are a district representative, then when you go to vote for them, how do you make sure that only the people that are in that district actually get to vote? And the only way you can do it is with a sub-precinct. So that's hard. It's hard to administer, it's hard for the clerk, and it complicates things a lot.
Thank you.
Laura, I got a quick question for you. I think I heard you say that the council president under a town council form of government is actually a kind of a different type of position than the rest of the councils. In other words, it's got more power, I guess.
Yes.
More authority. And that is, I heard that correctly. Because I think when we read, I think it was the North Attleboro Charter, I believe whoever gets the most votes becomes.
Yeah, I think.
And I think now, having like the Board of Selectmen here in Norton, I think for some of us, at least myself, it struck me as odd, because I was like, geez, just because I get the most votes doesn't necessarily mean I want to be the chairman.
Right.
And so I think I just wanted to clarify that. That is a big, I guess.
Yeah.
I was thinking town council, there's 11 of them, they're all just like our Board of Selectmen.
A council chair is typically the ceremonial head of government, because if you have a town council and a town manager, the town manager is really running the day-to-day, and the town council is making most of the legislative decisions, as well as certain types of executive decisions that are left to it by statute or by charter. So, typically, the legislative body town meeting isn't going to vote on, a policy about X, Y, or Z, and the town meeting's not going to vote on, whether to send a delegate to this or that event. But the council does that because it has that kind of hybrid role. A council president gets to set the agenda for every single meeting under the open meeting law. And because that in and of itself is a powerful thing, when you're trying to decide, what the council's agenda is going to look like and its policy agenda, that's already putting that person in a position of authority. Then typically they're also the ceremonial head. And then it depends, but if you look at the Amherst Charter, for example, the council president is the person that makes all appointments to council committees. And so that's also a very important piece of authority. And so they do run for council president, I think, although it might also be by popular vote there. Watertown has an elected council president. And, I think you had asked what the downside to that is. And what we have seen is that two really good people who would both be excellent counselors run for the council president position, and one of them is not going to be on the council at all. Because only one person is elected as the council president. So that's why that's, a potential downside of electing the town council president directly. The other thing is that during the campaign, people can make clear whether they want to be, it's like, I'm not gonna want that. I just want to get there and do my job. So that, hopefully that person who's really out there pushing and suggesting that they want that position is going to get more votes. Right. You can't make someone take the position, so that person could always decline. It would be the next highest vote getter if you write that in the charter.
Right, thank you for the clarification.
Is there a mechanism, so in the event that you do have an elected, you have to run specifically for town council president, is there a mechanism by which the runner-up, if they were to say, gather enough signatures to potentially beat another at-large person running?
You mean if they got enough votes?
Yes.
I've never seen that.
Okay.
It doesn't mean it's not possible, because it's a charter, you really have a ton of discretion. But it is not consistent with state law. State law is the top vote getter gets the job.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that you can't change it. It just, it would have to be, we'd really have to be clear in how it was drafted so that it doesn't leave people in a bind. I think one of the scariest things about a charter change, whether it's a local, whether it's a change to an existing charter or a brand-new form of government, is that there are so many unintended consequences, and no matter how hard you work on the words, there's still ambiguity. And so you wind up trying to figure out how to implement things, and that can take up a lot of time in that first few years. You know, a lot of towns will come back and make changes to brand-new charters because they think like, oh, that's not how we wanted that to work at all. This is a terrible
Yeah.
thing. We want this, or we want that.
Practicality, things are
Yeah.
always different.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, let's say, for example, if you've got 7 or 9 members and they're all running at large, and 2 of them are running for council president, the runner-up, let's say, gets, loses by a 60-40 margin, 40%, may beat out some of the other people who are running for just a at-large
Yeah.
spot.
But from a logistics point of view, this is one of those things where, like, from a hypothetical or theoretical viewpoint, that makes a ton of sense, and you can get that. But from the practical, if you're running for council president, there's 2 of you. And so when people cast a vote, they're casting a vote for one or the other. So they're likely to get more votes than,
Yep.
than some of the candidates who are, yeah. And so, yeah, I just don't think there's like a great way to correlate those 2 things.
Yep. Okay.
Is there a way to, in a charter, or a way that you can make that position just not be as important as other towns have made it? Like, for instance, instead of worrying about whether they're appointing committee members or having that amount of power, like, if they're just running the meeting, or if you're the ability to be, say, the status head of the council, can you take that ability away from them to do those things? So it's not such a coveted position. It's not something that the town should be worried about, wow, that person's gonna have so much power, where you can facilitate that power to, say, the town manager or the town administrator, to say, they'll make appointments to the committees, they'll be making appointments, and
In theory, again, you could, but if you think about, like, your committee, right? If you guys were the town council and you had a town manager who works for you, would you want that person telling you guys who could be on your committees? And the answer is probably not. And I'm not saying it's not a possibility. There are ways to make that position more or less powerful, but some of the things we're talking about, someone needs to be able to make the decisions, and you don't want to have to, try and make everybody happy all the time. Someone just has to be in charge. And the fact of if you're doing this as whoever got the most votes, then you're thinking, okay, this is the most popularly elected person, and so you're trusting them, most of the people who are elected, to make a decision as to what and I'm saying agenda, but what the policy positions should include, or what should be talked about. Minority members on a larger group typically will have less access to agendas, to agenda items, because that's just kind of the way that plays out.
what's personally, what's the smoothest, in your eyes, is the way to, for say a thing like us that we're trying, if we were gonna try to implement something like that, what do you think the smoothest way that would be able to say, okay, this is how we're gonna handle this, so we don't come into these pitfalls of, well, we're gonna have to change this again in a year or 2 when we realize it's a disaster?
I would like to say that it's possible to write, a perfect charter or to have a perfect form of government plan, but I don't think it is. I think really and I believe I mentioned this the last time, that what you really want to try and do is find the form that most reflects the government that you think you need, and that you think you can have, whether it's this form of government or any other form. And then then you can look at those things and you can fine tune them. So you look at the council president in Watertown and you look at the council president in Amherst and you say, gee, is that the kind of council president we want? Or should we look at, the council president in Southbridge or the council president here? And you can look at all those and you can try to say, oh, we like the idea of the council president being able to do this, but we don't like that. So maybe it's not that the council president gets to appoint everybody, but maybe it's the council president nominates the people and the council votes. So you can make gradations, different kind of layers of authority once you kind of decide how you want things to look. The other thing is, and this is really important, and it would be no matter it is right now, the relationship of the legislative to the executive is always going to be a struggle, because it has to be. Essentially, the legislative body is the body that's saying, this is how much you can spend, and the executive body is saying, this is what I'm going to spend. And so you see that two of them are always going to be arguing. This body, the executive is going to be saying, I need more flexibility, we need more money. The legislative body is saying, we need to be more careful on how we budget. We don't want you to have so much flexibility. The voters didn't elect you. The voters elected us, if you're the council. So it's really, in the charter, those checks and balances are really important, and getting that balanced correctly is, to me, what sells a charter to the community. Some communities, they really are afraid of having a person in a position called town manager. They don't want that. They want a board of selectmen, an elected body, to be making the day-to-day decisions, and they want the town manager really just to be kind of what we think of as a traditional town administrator, just carrying out what the board of selectmen tells them. In other communities, they're not worried about it at all, and they, in fact, prefer the board of selectmen to be more policy-based and have a trained professional do most of the day-to-day management. So it really is what's best for you guys. And I mean, certainly when you start looking at actual words, I can say to you, this is a policy decision right here. This is a policy decision right here. This is, what do you want this person to be able to do? And in fact, there's lists. I mean, they're in special acts and charters right now. I can pull them out for you. But you can look at the difference of, you could take the ability to sign warrants for payment, for example, take it from one person, give it to another person, or the ability of, an entity to act as a licensing authority. And Board of Selectmen typically acts as a licensing authority, but in some towns, there's a licensing commission or a licensing committee. And so there's those types of things. Gee, we want our board to be less constrained by day-to-day decisions. We don't want the Board of Selectmen having to decide on underground tanks, but we think it would be great for the building inspector to do that. So we'd like to transfer that responsibility. You can do that in the charter. So the duties and the powers that they exert should be the ones that you feel is the appropriate balance. And I can certainly look at it and say that is a really strong town council president, or that's not a strong town council president, but whether that's good or not, you guys get the big bucks, not me. You get all the fame and glory.
Any other questions on this topic? Okay. There was a question regarding to specifically the clause in some of the town council charters with right to postpone. And I was struggling with the fact that the discussion had to end as soon as somebody called for that, which I was of the opinion that if you're ceasing the discussion within the meeting, it's just instigating having a conversation outside of the meeting. I'm thinking specifically, you're going to postpone because you don't think you have the votes, and you want to postpone because you want the opportunity to sway other people, and the only way to sway other people legally is within the open meeting. So I was struggling with the fact that the conversation had to cease at that point. I do understand if you want to table it for a upcoming meeting, let's say it got heated and we need to put this aside and cooler heads need to prevail, but for the purposes of trying to sway other members, I guess, I was stuck with why.
I think if you think about it as a protection for the minority, it's easier to get. essentially, every charter that I know that has a council has a charter privilege of some kind. And that's so that anybody, for any reason, can just say, you know, I want to charter privilege that, or, you know, I want to assert my privilege, or whatever you want to call it. And it means that the conversation has to stop. So let's say that you are sitting at the table and you think all these people are trying to, you know, ram something through that you disagree with. You just raise your hand and get recognized and say, I'm asserting my charter privilege. And it means that they have to wait. So it's a way to prevent things from going too fast. It is a way to garner information. It doesn't necessarily mean it's amongst committee members. It could be, you know, let's say 5 of you are saying you're in favor of something, but I feel, if I was on the commission, the council, that if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't be willing to vote like that. I might say, you know, I'm going to use my charter privilege, and during that week, I'm going to go out and get the studies that I think, if you knew about, you wouldn't want to do X, Y, or Z thing. So it's, again, I think it's really intended for the minority, because the majority has the ability to just pass it.
Right.
So it's intended to put the brakes on something that an individual just doesn't want. It's a strategic tool, like move the question.
I do understand the reason for calling to postpone the vote. What I don't understand is the reason why discussion has to cease.
It's like moving the question.
Okay.
You know, at town meeting, when you're at town meeting and someone says, move the question, and there's still people in line and they want to talk, but everyone else is sick of talking, and so, you know, they move someone gets up and moves the question, and then basically the group just overrides the individuals at the thing. So it's like, no, that's it. We're done with this. Everyone, you know, take their feelings and their opinions and beliefs and leave that, you know, for another day.
Okay.
I mean, that is a parliamentary procedural kind of, you know, impression. It's left from those days, you know? So there are some procedural issues that you'll see in charters that are really relics of, you know, when things were much more formal.
Okay.
So there's nothing in the law that says that there can't be any further discussion, but that's typically the way it goes.
Okay. I don't necessarily disagree with it. I'm just trying to figure out specifically the rationale for it and why. But thank you, that was helpful. Does anybody have any more questions in regards to specifically the legislative branch? Okay. Executive branch, did we have any questions specifically? Yes.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Something you really do want to be thinking about if you're thinking about a town council form of government is whether you are going to have a mayor or not. And if you do have a mayor, the relationship between laws being passed by this group, you know, by the town council, but then requiring approval by the mayor. What types of things do you want to require approval for? And that's, again, a mayor can be as strong or as weak as the charter makes it. But you'll see in a lot of city charters and a lot of charters, there's a varying degree about the types of measures that have to be approved by the mayor before they can take effect. So you really do want to think about the types of things that you might want to do without the mayor's approval, if there was to be a mayor, and, you know, try to differentiate between that in the charter. So, you know, you can go on and look at a city council agenda to kind of get a feel for the things they vote on, and then have an idea, you know, so sometimes, for example, there's something in the Home Rule Amendment that says that you can't request a special act, that a council can't request a special act without the approval of the mayor if the charter so provides. So that's an example of where you might want to say, no, we don't want the mayor's approval for X, Y, or Z special act. We want to be able to, you know, reduce the mayor's authority or, you know, change the term of the mayor without the mayor having to say yes or no. So that's something to think about.
Okay. Any other questions there? I don't think we had raised, there were a few that came in after the fact. Does anybody have any questions with regards to executive branch? Okay, I think we're good there. Moving on, we had a question specifically with regards to elected town officers and boards and term limits. And, sorry, losing my train of thought. We did receive a response. I didn't know if there was any questions specifically regarding this. One of the questions that was raised that was not yet answered, what in the language of our charter in particular gives the Water and Sewer Commission its power?
Yeah. I didn't happen to bring your charter with me. Does anyone have it here?
I do. I'm going to warn you, it's
heavily marked up.
It's really marked up, yeah. There you are.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I won't be able to read that anyway, it's too small. All right. Water and sewer. Yeah. Okay. Well, there was an amendment to the charter several years ago with respect to the Water and Sewer Department. As I recall, the issue of who appoints the superintendent was left with the Board of Water and Sewer Commissioners rather than being provided to the town manager, as I recall.
No, we had it, the town manager.
Okay,
superintendent.
so maybe
We were-
that wasn't,
We were having the discussion on whether or not the Water Sewer Commission would be appointed.
oh, that's what it was about.
Elected.
Okay, okay.
We've had that discussion a few times.
Several times, yeah. Well, I mean, when I look here, all it says is the Board of Water and Sewer Commissioners have the authority that they do under the general laws. And what that typically means here, except as otherwise provided in the charter, but what that would mean here is that they have exclusive authority over the water and sewer facilities. Do they have an enterprise fund here? Okay, so I think, and again, I don't want to say anything that's not appropriate, but a lot of times it is quite common for departments that have enterprise funds to feel like they're really separate from town government. And in fact, an enterprise fund is really only a funding or accounting mechanism. So it doesn't really change anything in terms of their relationship to the town itself. Even the school department, and I'm making so many friends tonight, I'll just keep going. The school department, too, it's a body of the town. It's a town body. And so it, too, is subject to the charter unless a charter excludes it from certain things. I know, I told you I was making friends. So one of the things that we'll see is the charter might say, and you guys were talking about budgets when I came in. Charter might say, for example, the town manager or whoever shall set a budget schedule with budgets to be provided no later than February 1, okay? And so a lot of times, in circumstances like that, the superintendent might say, oh, I don't care. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do it by February 1. What's the matter? It's not my problem. But really, if you have a charter, then it is that person's problem. And again, I don't think people do that to be disrespectful. It's like, oh no, we have our process over here. But all the things that a charter says that a board and committee is subject to, then a board and committee is subject to. A lot of charters have language that says that despite the fact that these people hold elected positions, they're subject to the call of a town manager or a board of selectmen, and that in fact means your answer, if they ask you to be president and to participate, then you have an obligation to do so.
Hypothetically, then, if we were to switch, say, or transform into a DPW.
Yep.
With a single director.
Yes.
With a town council form of government.
Yes.
Could the director be the one responsible for managing that enterprise? Still keep it obviously named as enterprise account because it's fees collected from
That's just the way we account for the money, yes,
Exactly.
absolutely.
So then you don't even have to worry about whether or not a sewer commission is appointed or elected because it no longer exists.
Right.
And you're managing it under a DPW director.
Yeah.
Who's responsible for answering to a town manager on what the enterprise budget is and why they're setting fees and why they're setting permitting and all that other stuff.
Yes, because then really, when you're looking at setting fees, when you have just a DPW director and not a Board of Water and Sewer or DPW board, Board of Water, Board of Public Works, the issue that we typically see in that instance is that people get very concerned. Well, this DPW director is gonna set, they don't know us, they're coming in, they're from somewhere else, they don't know us, they're gonna set fees in a crazy way and blah, blah, blah. So typically what I will do is I'll write in a public hearing requirement into the charter so that if that's gonna happen, then the DPW director has to hold a public hearing, notice of which is published at least 2 weeks in advance, for 2 weeks, and then, appear before the council with that proposal after that, before those take effect, and make it so that they have to be on file in the clerk's office for at least 2 weeks before they take effect, that kind of thing. So that is what we see with water and sewer. That's usually people's concern is that, that the boards that they're used to are more kind of connected to the people here, and that having a DPW director is going to take away their ability to weigh in. So adding in a public hearing process can help with that.
What's the general consensus on how they do it with an open town meeting is if they wanted to, say, disband the Water Sewer Commission and put it under, say, what, just the town manager?
Yeah, you can do that. You could do, a charter can do anything. So, anything with respect to form of government. So, a lot of towns have, in their charters, they have different departments. So they have a Department of Public Works, they have a Department of Municipal Finance, they have a Department of, I think I gave the Nantucket one, Planning and Land Use, or Planning and Economic Development, or whatever it is. And the charter says the department head is gonna be this person appointed by the town manager, either subject to approval of a select board or not. There's sometimes where they're not. And then there's different ways of dealing with the employees. The employees could be appointed by those department heads after consultation with the town manager, or they could be appointed by the town manager. Elected boards, when there's changes like this with departments, their concern typically is, look, I want to make sure that the person that works for my board is doing what my board says is the right policy. We don't want, if we're the Board of Health, we don't want the health agent doing things that are because the town manager said. We want them to do things because we said so. So that's another thing that you can write into the language of the charter that makes it clear. Yeah, they report to the department, to the town manager for purposes of, are they showing up at work? And are they, if it's the animal control person, is the animal control person, really sitting in their truck, sleeping, instead of being out doing that? Well, if the Board of Health or whoever's going to be overseeing that position is an elected board, they're only meeting once a week at whatever time. They're not there to oversee it. So the idea is you can take those pieces of authority and distribute them in the way that makes the most sense for the town. So they could be subject to the town's personnel policies, subject to the town's hours requirements, same with vacation requirements and all of that, versus having that decided on a more piecemeal basis.
Can I ask a follow-up to when you were talking about the Water Sewer Commission having power? If I'm understanding you correctly, they really don't have, is their role pretty much like the planning board's role? Or do they have more authority in terms of their department?
Well, I think the planning board itself, the planning board is undertaking permissions for particular things. The water and sewer department is actually running an operation. So I think that's what the difference is. Planning board is even when it's doing something important like a special permit or reviewing zoning bylaws, it is more policy driven in general, and then they're kind of following the rules that town has set for it. And they're also making recommendations, and it's a very, very important role. The difference is it's less on the ground. They're actually not running the they're not running the construction project that they're permitting, they're just giving out the rules for it.
And is the relationship between the commissioners and the superintendent, I mean, who does the superintendent answer to? Does he answer to the town manager, does he answer to the commissioners?
So, again, I mean, that's an answer that I have to do the lawyer talk, which is, it depends. In some towns, all of the department heads answer directly to the town manager, and that's it. You know, the policy boards make policy, but they're not saying, go out and do the test today here, go do that. The department head is responsible for running the department, and if they have issues that they need to have addressed, they don't wait until the next Thursday when the board meets, or they don't call the board chair and say, is this okay? They walk down the hall to the town manager and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing, are you cool with that? But it doesn't mean, and that's exactly what they say, are you cool with that? That's, nice ad-libbing. So it really does, it depends. And there's some communities where, the history is, whether because they're an enterprise fund or not, that certain things are hands-off. Water and sewer, you need to have a certain level of expertise, so not everyone has that expertise. And so, the operations side of things is often handled differently. But again, whether something's an enterprise fund or not is irrelevant. It's just an accounting mechanism for the way that you budget their money. So water and sewer, how they act and what they are allowed to do depends on what the charter says.
And the way our charter is written, how is that? Like, in terms of, do they have the power?
Well, it says that they have exclusive control of the water and sewer. So that's pretty strong language. I also think there's just a history here of them having.
That's what I guess
yeah.
I'm curious of, how much of it is a history and perception, and how much of it is a language in our charter?
It's probably a good combination of both.
I think the water super answers to the town manager. He gets hired by a town manager. And the board's elected, and they basically do their own budget, they get their own money, like you said,
Yeah.
it's a private account, so.
So that point, though, which is really interesting, because the way we just said, do their own budget, in a lot of places, the town management is responsible, whether it's a finance director or whatever, for all the budgeting, for all the departments except for the school department has their own business manager who does that with the superintendent. But the town manager or town administrator will make all the budgets, and including for all of the enterprise funds. And in fact, you may not know this, but in the general laws relative to enterprise fund statutes, it says that the Board of Selectmen has to recommend that for it to be put before town meeting, which probably never happens, because it's, it's not typically, usually the departments come forward, they say, this is what I'm thinking, and that'll go in the town manager's budget, let's say. But a lot of times that's generated by the town side and not by a board.
This is a two-part question. Like, do you, with other towns that have our type of open town meeting with a water sewer commission that has the amount of power that they have in the charter, do you see that it's always some type of issue, or is it that we're kind of different because of the issues we've been going through with our water?
Oh, very good two-part question. I think it's the way the language in the statutes deal with water and sewer, exclusive power over the water and sewer. I think that does kind of imbue water and sewer commissions with a greater sense of authority than perhaps other town departments do. And again, because they're actually operating a system. The fact that you have open town meeting, so open town meeting, representative town meeting, town council with a manager, town council with a mayor, city council, city manager, or mayor, right? In each of those cases, that there's no required setup, except that the reality is that the more centralized the authority becomes, the more important it is that someone's in charge. Because the more authority you give to an executive, the more important it is that someone's in charge. Because, I don't know if Bill talked about this at all, but when they go out and look for jobs, when town managers do, like, they're looking to see, what am I in charge of? Do I get to hire and fire? And if I don't, what hoops do I have to jump through? If I have to work with these department heads and they have to be responsible to me, but I have no authority as to whether to hire them, that's not something that's particularly attractive, because they're basically little islands unto themselves. So you have each department operating on its own. And I think that's hard for town managers, because they're trained to manage people, that's their job, and then, you have like this whole group of people that can't be managed, that they have no authority to manage. So I think that's what the kind of balance is, not whether it's town meeting or not. Town meeting, that's a legislative side, and which obviously, if you think of the town council and the town meeting as the same thing, and the board of selectmen and a town manager as the same thing, it's easier to see what happens when you get to a town council form of government. Because basically, almost all the power of the board of selectmen defaults to the town manager. You need someone to be making decisions on the day-to-day. And then now you have this, so whereas before, under the general laws, the board of selectmen appoints tons of people, right? Tons of positions, and then each department appoints positions. So it is an island unto itself here and there. The Board of Health gets to appoint the health agent, the planning board gets to appoint the town planner, the zoning board gets to appoint the zoning administrator. It's literally so there's this little island and this one and this one and this one and this one. And so as things have evolved, the charters take some of those pieces of authority and they give them to someone else, all to facilitate kind of a day-to-day operation. And the idea of having one person who's trained in personnel issues and finance issues and, not municipal finance, municipal governance issues, contracting. The idea is, if a town manager, for example, can't require that department heads go through the procurement processes that are legal, you wind up with this board doing it this way, and this board doing it that way, and this board doing it this way. And that's really hard to be in charge of. And then the manager gets blamed, even if the manager can't control it because of the limits on their authority. So all of this kind of, if what you're looking at is whether you're a legislative branch, and again, I don't know exactly where you guys are because I haven't been watching you on TV. If you're worried about the legislative
Telling
branch,
information.
I know it is. The legislative branch as town meeting, what are the pluses, what are the minuses of town meeting? And that's open town meeting. And when you look at that, and you could say, okay, it takes too long to call, and there's too many people that have to show up. And sometimes if it isn't something that people are interested in, they don't come. Or if they're interested, they come, and they've never come any other time, and why do they get to weigh in like that? So then you have the concept of representative town meeting, which is these are people that are essentially saying, I'm going to represent my neighbors, and I'm going to do what my neighbors think I should do. So you'll hear every representative town meeting you ever go to, you'll hear them say, like, I'm precinct 4, and I've heard from a lot of my constituents this week, and they blah, 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 Their job is to be a representative of other people. But it means they get the materials, they're more likely to look at the materials ahead of time, they're more likely to come in prepared for the discussions. But it's not a guarantee. I mean, some of the best town meetings I've ever been to are open town meetings, and some representative town meetings are just very difficult to sit through. And then a town council. So why have a town council? Well, a town council, think about it, if you mess up appropriations at a town meeting and you want to set the tax rate, you've got to call for a special town meeting. You've got to get that to happen. It's got to be at least 2 weeks. And then here in Norton, it's longer and longer. So you have all of that drama that needs to go with just trying to fix a couple things. If you have a town council, you can fix those things in an easier fashion, because you can just call a meeting. You can have a special meeting. You got 9 people to wrangle, or 11 or 13, but you're not, it's not 100. And people do feel oftentimes like it's it's a different kind of representation. So voters are looking to specific people and saying, I want a new stop sign, rather than just coming into a town meeting and saying, let's, we'll do these 5 roads this year. It's like, no, I want my road done, and I told you this 97 times, and I need my road, and my road's the most important. So there's human face to go with the concerns. And then, so it's faster, there's a direct person. But, the concern in North Attleboro for sure was, right now we have however many people show up, 150 people or 300 people that want to come and weigh in on things. And if we go from that number to 9, is that going to really be how we want our community to express itself? So, and then I know Bill talked about, I'm sorry, I forget.
Mike.
Hunts, yeah. They have, in some of the in some of the town council forms of government, they'll have a biannual town meeting that they require. And it's not a meeting where anything's done, it's just kind of like a state of the town kind of thing, to try and encourage people to be involved. In towns where there's a town council, there's less likely to be as many elected boards, at least in my experience. And it's not that it's required, it's just a common result. Basically because there's a lot more professionalization of the services that are provided, and so rather than deal with it, again, as we were talking about, an employee who answers to an elected board that only comes in one night every other week, if you don't have that elected board, if they're providing guidance but not operational direction, then there's not as much of a need for that role. So it's not about how much power and authority each of these individual bodies has is not a reflection of town meeting or a town council. But it is a reflection of the words in the actual charter. So when you guys are thinking about what's best for you, you have to say to yourselves, okay, well, we do want the public to be involved. How do we want to do that? What's the appropriate level of involvement here? Okay, we do want the town manager to be able to do X, Y, or Z. What's the appropriate level of authority here? And those things are policy decisions, and then you write down the words after. You make the decisions first. And the way the charter is organized, it's useful because it can help you to do that. You're looking at the different functions of the different boards as you go through and the different parts of the charter, so.
Any follow-up questions to that? We had a question specifically related to the planning board and whether there was a benefit to having them appointed versus elected.
Yep.
Lauren had provided some responses to that and some good points. Did anybody have any follow-on questions?
No, I think I think I initially asked the question, I think. Who knows what I really meant, but but I think I was just getting at, to me, certain bodies represent the voters, and some represent, like FinCom, for example, to me, probably is no more of a, it shouldn't be an elected position by its very nature, what it does, versus planning board. I guess I was kind of struggling a little bit, like which side of that falls on.
Yeah. Well, the state law provides for either. So it's already, I think it's a debate in general. I think I might have mentioned this last time, but some towns have been, and North Attleboro did this, they changed the composition of several of their boards to be partly appointed and partly elected, to essentially try to be representative of both issues. The appointed people would be people that had some experience in the area, that were believed to make good and rational decisions, and then not that elected officials don't make good rational decisions. Again, me ad-libbing, that's really working exceptionally well. And then the other positions are elected, so it's due to the normal process. One of the risks of any board, whether it's elected or appointed for the planning board, is that the fact that these projects continue past election day. So one of the things to think about for that could be the day on which newly elected officials take office, if you're looking at that. So you can move like the taking office to July 1, for example, rather than in the middle of the spring when you're in the middle of a bunch of applications. So those are the types of things that people do to deal with that. And also having alternates is another way of dealing with it. If the alternates are appointed every year or every other year, you can do it on a different track than the elected is, so that you have a little more
Right.
flexibility.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I was just looking at it from the perspective of, a planning board to me sets, they're setting the zoning laws. What kind of town do you want to have? You want congested, big lots, that kind of thing. To me, that's what the citizens want, so you should vote that vote in, perhaps. That was kind of my thought.
Well, I think there's a number of elected planning boards in the state still.
This is my personal opinion, but that's my question was coming from, kind of.
Yeah, and I think you can make, this is one of the major policy decisions for a charter, is which board should be elected and which should be appointed. And one of the ways to kind of look at that is to look at election records over the past, X number of years. You can ask Lucia to get you some of the statistics for that, which offices are contested, which offices aren't contested. That can give you an idea, how many appointments are being made to fill positions in elected offices because people resign. And, what is the role of that body? And, you can see the arguments in both directions. And I think that is why North Attleboro wound up with both, because they thought it was kind of, they increased the number of their boards from 3 to 5 members and had the 2 new members be appointed.
Thank you.
One of the questions that came up subsequent was, how do towns decide on the number of representative town meeting members?
I think, in my experience, what they're doing is they're looking at the total number of voters and they're trying to figure out how many people normally come to town meeting out of that. And of those people, if we're looking at annual meetings versus special meetings, what's the right number of people? And then they say, how many precincts do we have? And they divide.
Okay.
There are some that have up to 300. There's some that have like 250. A lot of them, if you are looking at trying to kind of figure out that right number, you could say, all right, well, we have 5 precincts, and if we elected, 5, if we're talking representative town meeting, we elect 5 or 9 from every precinct, and then if we add a precinct, what's that number going to be? And you have to think if that seems reasonable. The other thing to think about, and I know this is really goofy, is most of the time, materials related to town meeting are mailed to each and every town meeting member, and it usually says they have to be in the charter. So the bigger your town meeting, the more expensive it is because of the mailing. So you could think about not including a mailing requirement, or, being like requiring an email address so that you could send the information electronically. Also, the bigger the meeting, as you might imagine, the more people that want to speak.
So a mailing requirement a physical mailing requirement is not a state mandate?
No.
Okay,
Even if it was, you'd be able to change.
okay.
Is there a minimum number that you have to have for RTM?
I don't know. There is a representative town meetings general law, and the thing about it is only Brookline and Arlington use it, so it's not what most other communities are operating under. I think there's a debate, but, at some point, it's like, is it a council, is it an RTM? But, I think you could clarify that.
And then, once you set that number and that's in the charter, there's no changing, no adding?
You could, typically you want to be thinking about what happens if you add another precinct, because most communities do grow over time, so you don't want to have to come back to change it if you get another precinct. But if you had 7 and then you decided you wanted 9 per precinct, or if you had 11, you decided you want 15, whatever it is, you could amend the charter for that purpose. And that could be done 2 ways. 1, as a special act, or 2, through an elected charter commission. So you would probably use a special act.
So you in theory could have a representative town meeting that say, I don't know, how many precincts in Norton? Five? So you could have a.
Like 60
RTM
people?
Or even less? I mean, could you do 15 or
And,
20?
I mean,
What's the point?
Is that a representation?
It is a representation, right?
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think if you're starting, you're probably talking, starting somewhere around 60. I can't imagine less than
I was just
that
throwing
would
it
be,
out, just-
yeah, would be
Back, but-
appropriate, but you don't have to limit yourself to that either. I mean, it's really a decision about what you think works best. Get the numbers from how many people checked in at town meetings over the past few years.
Yeah, our last town meeting was less than 140 people, and I think it's generally south of 200 each time.
So you're not going to have a representative town meeting of 250 people.
No.
So that's, that's really what you're trying to figure out is what's the right number so that the people who really want to participate are able to participate. Most representative town meetings will also allow residents and registered voters to speak at town meeting with the permission of the moderator. So it's not as though people can't come if they're not representative town meeting members. You can write that into the charter if you want to.
I think the struggle I'm having also is looking at the, let's say, 150 to 200 people that show up, how many of those would actually truly be interested in being a representative member of town meeting officially, as opposed to, showing up and just raising their hand.
I don't know, in my experience, representative town meeting members take their jobs very seriously.
No, I understand that, but of the couple of hundred that actually show up, how many are willing to actually go that extra step?
Yeah, I was essentially saying the backwards answer, which is, I think people really like to be, in my experience, the people who are representative town meeting members, there's always more candidates than there are spaces, and people typically are very interested in being a representative town meeting member. But, I think it's personal to the person.
Yeah, because I can envision where you might only get 120 people go to town meeting because they just, you went to a couple and you never going back. Whereas a representative town meeting is going to be run a lot differently and presumably more process, and, it'd be a different form altogether. And so you might get people who would engage in that type of form of government where they're like, I don't want to be engaged in this open town meeting form of government. I don't understand it, I don't feel comfortable,
I think,
Participation.
Yeah, that's what I'm sort of thinking, so I'm not so sure, just because we only had 140 people at the last
Yeah.
town meeting, it may or may not represent, we may get more people interested in representing town meeting, just because you are representing your neighbors, and I think you take that more seriously, and ego trip to a certain extent maybe even, but, you get more people engaged, I would think.
sometimes we joke because we'll go to a representative town meeting and every representative will want to speak. It's like, we have been here a long time, we've heard the pros and the cons, a vote is ready, let's do it. But I think people really do kind of enjoy that, and a lot of times what they do in towns with representative town meetings is that they have a committee of precinct chairs, and so the precinct chairs will meet, they'll do rules, they'll talk about how they want to, bring what's going to be on the town meeting warrant back to their different precincts. They'll have like a precinct gathering for each of their, for their constituents to come to and talk to them. They'll tell them what's on the warrant, and people will give them feedback. If there's like a big project or something, the department that has the project will come and go to each of the precinct meetings and do the explanation. There's definitely lovely things about it. But it can be a lot of work. The moderator has a much more significant job in a representative town meeting, because basically motions and things like that are more formal. So like a moderator is able to say, like, I need every motion that's gonna be every, substitute motion I wanna have in my hand by 12 o'clock the day before, or they might, say, anyone who wants to make a motion to amend can do it, but if it's more than 2 sentences, we want a copy for everyone in the building, or in the room, so that, they're more involved in kind of directing how the meeting runs.
So the RTM, do they have public meetings, like with the selectmen, and have to invite the public?
So the RTM is typically, it's the members of the representative town meeting, they get to go to it. But they do, I was saying, they do typically allow the residents and voters, registered voters to attend. The warrant is still the Board of Selectmen's warrant. So the Board of Selectmen will typically still go to town meeting. What role they have depends. In Burlington's charter, for example, it says that they're kind of honorary members of the representative town meeting for the ability to participate. But in others, like in Walpole, you have to run for that office if you want it. If you're a member of the board and you're not an RTM member, you don't get to vote on things. You just sit there. So there's a check and a balance on the activity that happens. And in that circumstance, the finance committee is essentially advising the rest of the RTM. So they are answerable to the RTM. It's typically a group of members of the RTM. It feels different. It's a different legislative process. It doesn't affect the executive side, so that's a change to the legislative side. But the executive branch can stay the same, or it can be changed in the way that's, deemed to be the most appropriate. So those two things are not necessarily, you don't have to have a very, very, very strong, town manager and an RTM, or a very, very strong Board of Selectmen and RTM. You can have whatever version of that you feel comfortable with. It's really just saying, let's change the way we do this legislative process over here.
Any other questions regards to elected town offices or boards? Okay, we'll move on to town manager. We had some discussions with regards to residency requirements. From what I understand, there seems to be a trend to move away from that.
Definitely.
Okay. Were there any questions specific to that? Okay. Administrative organization. Another one we've had some discussion and gotten some feedback from other areas about, should the moderator be solely responsible for appointing FinCom?
Yep. It's a fascinating question. It's a policy question.
Yep.
In the general laws right now, it says that you can create a bylaw. By bylaw, you can create a FinCom. It doesn't say about who has to appoint. Again, I think the idea was that the FinCom would be appointed by the moderator because the FinCom was answering to the meeting, not to a particular board or committee. And so they wanted the FinCom to be independent of other boards and committees. That is not the way it's done everywhere. In some places, it's just appointed by the Board of Selectmen. In some places, there's, members that are appointed by a different committee will appoint that finance committee. And in others, they're half elected, half appointed. So they're done in any number of ways. And just so you know, there's a trend to call it a finance and warrant committee, or a warrant and finance committee, finance and warrant committee, because they're doing more than just financial things. They're also giving advice on warrant articles.
Right.
And so,
Which we actually had a question about.
Yeah, I saw that
as well. Any questions specifically regards to FinCom and how they are appointed? One of the things that we'd actually just read about, we were talking about any benefit to having composition of the boards within a charter versus the bylaws. One of the things that we just read in advance of meeting with Mr. Dutton was they have an administrative code.
Yeah.
Not a fan?
It's very hard for me to understand what an administrative code is.
Okay.
Because to me, you have bylaws or ordinances, and then you have a charter. Like, I don't really understand the administrative code. I know it's in a bunch of people's bylaws, but a bunch of municipal bylaws, but very few actually have it. So I'm going to check theirs out.
Yeah.
That might help me.
it seemed intriguing in the fact that, okay, it's not within the charter, so you don't have to struggle of amending it if and when you wanted to, but you also don't have the, it's easier to amend. You may not want them to.
You know, a lot of times those provisions in charters say something like the town manager can present an administrative code, which the Board of Selectmen has to hold a hearing on, and then in 60 days it can either approve or deny. And so it's almost inconsistent with the idea of the bylaws, which the bylaws or the ordinances is basically the legislative body says, this is our kind of general deal. This is what we're comfortable with. Again, great ad-libbing. And so this is what we're in favor of. Just because something isn't in a bylaw doesn't mean it can't be a policy. It doesn't have to be in a code, that you're coming back to. So I don't know. I think you don't want to, and I know I mentioned this, or at least I hope I did. You really are trying to balance in your charter too much information and too little. You don't want to make it so overly detailed that, if someone oversleeps one day and comes in late, they'll have violated the charter. And some of the charters, especially in the finance sections, are so overly detailed, it's really difficult. Same with mentioning every single board and committee. You don't need to do that in the charter. The charter should mention those boards and committee that are permanent, and that's it. Things that you want to have forever and ever. Whether we have an open space committee and a playground committee and a this committee and that committee, that does not all need to be directed by the charter. You can address the appointing authority for all those other committees in the charter. That's pretty easy, actually. You could either say, the Board of Selectmen will appoint all boards, multiple member board and committees, unless there's a bylaw that says otherwise, or you could say, town manager will appoint all multiple member bodies unless, or you can say if the moderator wants to create a committee, then the moderator can appoint the multiple member body. So you can deal with that without mentioning every single one. And most towns, I think, when they do start looking at what to put in their charter, they find there's like 100 committees, and some of them haven't met in a long time, and some of them do meet, and this one was never disbanded, and so you don't want that all cluttering up your charter.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Do you recommend specifying the size of the committee? So in other words, the finance committee is made up of 11 members. Is that something that should be in the charter, or should that be in bylaws?
I think that depends. That's the lawyer answer. You'd want the size of the council to be in a charter, or a size of a board of selectmen to be in a charter. If you're going to set the size of things by bylaw, then you need to think about how that's going to work in terms of the practical reality. So if you say you have a 5-member finance committee in the charter, then you're stuck with that 5 forever. But if you say you have an 11, then you're stuck with that forever as well. So I do think there are some towns that try to do that fine-tuning by bylaw. I do not recommend saying between 5 and 7, because then the problem is who's making that decision and how are they making it? And how do we figure out the quorum for purposes of action? So it's one thing if you say a range, maybe you say a range in the charter and then you set the actual number by bylaw. But, I don't recommend ranges in charters. If that's it, if there's no bylaw to implement it, just set the number of years.
I guess in general, other than say the selectmen, I think that should be a set number, and maybe a few other committees, but my personal opinion is you're probably better off putting it in the bylaws.
The bylaws, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
I think you'll typically find that it is in charters, though.
I would agree.
Yeah,
I think
I'm not telling you that's the right thing, it's just
Yeah,
typically you'll
I would
find
agree.
them
You
there.
see it a lot of times.
Yeah.
If you don't have, if you say 11 for the finance committee, you don't have 11 people interested.
Yeah.
You got a problem.
Yeah, you do. And because the quorum, under the open meeting law, a quorum for action is a majority of the members of the entire body, not a majority of the members then in office. So if you don't have 11 people, and it's hard to get a quorum, that can be a problem.
Okay, I'm not sure I was aware of this. So in the event you have a 7-member body and somebody has resigned.
The quorum does not typically change.
Okay.
For the Conservation Commission, there's a different rule when they're acting under the State Wetlands Protection Act. I have a lot of really exciting information in this, Ed. So that's an exception to the general rule, and you can kind of see why the Conservation Commission needs to save the world. They can't, necessarily stop functioning because somebody, resigned.
Got it.
But for other boards and committees, that is the general rule. If you wanted to change that, you do it in the charter. That's the only, you cannot do that, you can't do that by bylaw, you have to do it by charter.
Okay, so we could set it to a quorum of the sitting members,
Of those then in office.
those then in office. Okay, so we have that option. Okay,
That is different than the open meeting law, so every time you get an open meeting law complaint, you're gonna have to send a copy of your charter provision if that's how you do it.
Okay.
And again, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, I'm just saying you can see that coming.
okay. So we had a question as to whether there have been any charter commissions that have specifically taken on formation of a DPW within its tasks, also changing the form of government.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay,
I know that many times what happens in a charter, especially, when it's kind of a top to bottom review, is the creation of departments.
Okay.
That's pretty common. But how that's presented is another thing. I think I had mentioned that in Dedham, they did a number of different things, and they basically said, these are things, they did the same thing in Medway, these are things we're not worried about at all. We think everyone's behind it, we're gonna go with that. For these things, we only wanna do it if people really approve of it. We don't want them to say no to the whole charter change just because of this one thing. So that's a policy decision that's worthy of thought. With a charter commission, you typically present your proposal in one article. And so if you think people will hate X, Y, or Z idea, and some people will love it, you have to think, are the people that are gonna hate it enough to have it voted down?
okay.
So I often say, just because there's a million things you think you want to do, you really should think about what you can get people to agree to.
Okay.
Because the sale of the program at the end is just as important as the work you're doing now, even though it might not feel like it.
If I understood, I'm sorry. If I understood that correctly, so it's typically presented as one article, then
Yes.
take it or leave it, I guess you could say.
Mhm.
But you could break it up into pieces? Or
Well, if you're doing it as a charter amendment, then you can present different things. There have been a few charter commissions, I believe. I don't know if they had to get special legislation or not, where they had like option A, option B, and whichever option got more votes was gonna be the one that passed. But that might have taken a special act to do that. I think Reading did their charter like that, and somebody else as well.
But is that that's only for an amendment, you're saying?
No, they got special legislation for that. I think they did. I can double check.
Tired different charters, right?
That's right, pick one or two or whatever it was, yeah. It is.
I am assuming that the formation of so we've created the department of a DPW, the formation of which and the practicality of which would be covered within the transition provisions and probably some committee or subcommittee subsequent to the voting, as opposed to the charter commission trying to establish the policy or the process.
Yeah. North Attleboro, they did that.
Okay.
They had a transition committee that was, as soon as the charter passed, there was, I think, 3 or 4 months until the town council elections were to occur. And so they had a charter implementation committee in between. I know Amherst also had an implementation committee. That's job it was to kind of figure out how to do some of the things that needed to get accomplished.
Okay.
So like one of the things that, on the same lines of DPW that we've heard over and over again is like something like an HR director. So you create a position or even if you want to call it Department of HR, and you want to make it as an appointment from the town manager. that's fine for us to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, to say that's a position that the town manager can appoint, and if the transition is gonna take effect, say, July, if it were to be approved, what's to say that the town goes, we don't have any money for it, sorry.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's just in the charter, so it's like a potential or a possibility that could be hired, but really no one's gonna, there's no teeth to it to say that the town has to really look into doing this.
So,
It's in there now.
Well, I'm just using HR as an example.
Yeah,
'cause
so-
we brought up, but
there's a
a
broad,
few of them that we've heard, you know, with recurring things that, well, we need to establish this. Well,
Yeah.
some of them already are established. So,
so, one of the difficulties, I think, in government, I talked before about kind of that balance between the legislative and the executive. The legislative body appropriates money for things. It's essentially an authorization to spend. But the legislative body cannot require the executive side to take the action it's authorized. Very, very few examples of when that can happen. So let's just say town meeting votes to authorize the acquisition of a piece of land, and then when the town goes to acquire the land, it's like, oh, no, this part of it seems like it's polluted, we don't want that part. They don't have to go back to town meeting and ask, can we not exercise this authority? They can just not exercise it. Essentially, where a statute or a charter is leaving something to the discretion of the entity of the executive branch, there's nothing. Like, so we've heard fights about, on town meeting floor, about firefighters. You know, we want money to fund new firefighter positions, and the fire chief gets up and says, we have enough firefighter positions. We're not looking for 24-hour coverage. We're looking for, 18-hour coverage. We're good. And then town meeting's like, well, this is ridiculous. We want people to be able to get from here faster, and we want the money, and so it's appropriated. But nobody can make the fire chief spend the money or hire those people. And honestly, and I know this may not be everybody's favorite message, but it's kind of dangerous to think about what would happen if you did that, because, and this is an example, if town meeting could say, you have to hire person X, the manager or whoever might say, well, that person's not qualified. You guys don't. I did the background research. I have the Corey report. I don't want to hire that person. So there's no way to have town meeting be able to kind of force its will on the executive branch. That's one of those checks and balances things.
so for us, if we are looking at it from a total, outside the box thing of saying, look, this is what we know should be in the charter, we should make the decision based on that and let the chips fly, let them fall where they're gonna fall.
Because the legislative body, whoever it is going to decide whether to fund it. And, that's the other thing is that, town meeting might think it'd be great to have, let's just say, an HR director. But the budget may be such that there's just no money for that. And so if we had to do that, then we have to lay off someone else. And so we might need that other person too. And again, when I started off, at some point I said, like, someone has to make a decision. Someone has to be in charge. And that's the difference. And if someone feels really strongly that the decisions that are being made aren't the right decisions, then they have to decide whether they want to be the decision maker. And that's a different role than a legislative role.
So, question though, isn't it technically a violation if you say in your charter, HR topic is come up, right, that you need to have an HR director? And isn't that technically a violation if you don't have one? And even if that means that if I hire one and instead of lay somebody else off, by putting it in the charter, aren't you saying that position is more important than maybe some kind of?
No. And this is very frustrating to some people. The charter contains a number of directions, right? It's directions about how the town government's going to work. But not all of it's enforceable. So in many cases, it's directory, not mandatory. Failing to do something that a charter says you're supposed to do may be a technical violation, but you still can't make someone do it. There are ways to try and hold town officials to be more accountable, but that's more about reporting and, supervision.
Reviews and stuff?
Exactly. When you take, let's just say, again, let's take the town manager and an HR director. And I want you to know, I mean, I'm not talking about anything having to do with here the entire night. I'm just, kind of, as we know, ad-libbing. But let's say that town manager X has amazing personnel skills. They were an HR director. The town wouldn't have to spend the money on an HR director if they have a manager who's got HR skills. Similarly, like a lot of times it'll say the finance director shall appoint an accountant or a treasurer, or serve as one or the other if they have that ability. Because the idea is you don't want to make there have to be those two different positions if you have a person who's capable of doing both. If let's say you want to put a consequence in the charter for something, like what would the consequence be, let's just say hypothetically, for not choosing to spend money on an HR director? Like whose job is it to follow up on that?
Great question, I don't know.
Right, because town meeting can't, like, even if you went to court and you said, court, tell them they have to do this, and the court would say, no, that's their discretion. So the appointing authority would be who you look to. Who's the appointing authority of the person that's not hiring an HR director? So that's where you get your enforcement. And so, at some point, the elected officials are the ball's gonna, the wonder ball or whatever, is gonna stop there, and they're the ones that have to take ownership of that. So you can try to write something like that into the charter, but truly, unless there's an actual consequence, so if the town does not hire an HR director by X date, it shall not be able to do any more capital projects. You'd actually have to say something like that. And then where would you be? Because then you couldn't do any more capital projects.
So, in your opinion, so it's probably for the best of our interest is to look at what's going to be best for the voters, what's going to be best to make our charter the most feasible for the people in town.
Mm-hmm.
And don't worry, because what I'm afraid of is that we start looking at creating, just for instance, HR department, if we had DPW, the things that keep getting brought up over and over again.
Mhm.
Well, it's going to take us 2 seconds to figure out that Norton doesn't have the budget for these type of things.
Mhm.
So instead of worrying about, in our position, whether or not there's money for it, in my personal opinion, is we shouldn't be worried about that. We should be worried about what's the best interest in our charter, and then let those positions be created in the charter so it gives the legislative and executive the ability to say, hey, we can do this year when this money comes up, or when the budget works out.
So there's ways to get there, and I think one of the first things is you can create the departments in the charter, right? So you say water, sewer, this, that, whatever. That's all going to be as part of the Department of Public Works. And actually, if you look at Westwood's charter, they did something like this. It was like an interim type of thing. And all they did there is they said it's one department. They're going to try to utilize resources throughout the department. But they still had a this and a that and a this and a that. They still had all those positions. But it also gave them the flexibility to have those positions consolidated if the executive and the legislative bodies supported that. So the other thing is just taking away, and again, we're talking about taking these different pieces of everybody's jobs. If you put a group of people into a department, a group of responsibilities into a department, and you say that they're going to be a single department with, I forget what the word is, a single department that coordinates services, that they will have a, whatever it's going to be called, a planning and land use director, right? So somebody's going to be the planning and land use director, but it doesn't mean that that person isn't also going to be a conservation agent or this or that. And so, that's a way that your charter, it can provide for it, and at some point, that might be funded as a separate position, but it doesn't have to be funded as a separate position, for it to still exist. And sometimes that's what's required. You need somebody to kind of be in charge there, so that's a way of making someone in charge, even though they also have other responsibilities. And that often, like the finance director serving as the accountant or the treasurer, that's a really common thing. So those are the types of things you could look to.
Any other questions regards to administrative organization, departments, appointments? Okay. Financial fiscal policies and procedures. We actually just talked to one tonight. Bridgewater apparently still has a FinCom as well as a subcommittee on their town council.
It's not, yeah.
Didn't sound like it was functional.
It is quite often the case that a town council will have a financial committee subcommittee, a finance committee subcommittee. It doesn't mean that you can't add people from outside of the council. So Southbridge, for example, they have a bunch of different committees, and they also have registered voters on those committees, but they are subcommittees of the council. You know, again, this is one of those things where you have the ability to do it if you want to. So you could create both of those types of bodies, but then what would they do? What are their roles, and how do you differentiate? And, you know, do you need reports from them both? And how many meetings are you actually going to have here at night, and all those kinds of things.
All right, so it doesn't necessarily have to just be a subcommittee of town council if we wanted to go that route.
Doesn't just have to be a subcommittee of town council members.
Okay.
Right, you can still have it be a subcommittee of the town council that also includes, yeah.
We touched on this a little bit. In Norton, the FinCom renders a recommendation on all of the
Yes.
articles, regardless of whether they're financial or otherwise. And we've seen some questions as to whether that's required, and having read a few charters, it doesn't appear to be.
It is not required. It's not even required by state law.
Okay. Is there a trend or a preferred?
I think it is quite common for the FinCom to give recommendations on all articles that have any financial consequence, so that's a pretty obvious one. I think a lot of times lately, the changes has been to have the planning board make the recommendations on the zoning articles and not have the FinCom involved in that. In a lot of communities, especially with a representative town meeting, the main motion on the floor is the recommendation of the FinCom or of the planning board if it's a zoning article. So that's typically that. You know, it's really a matter of preference. You know, if the finance committee is kind of a gatekeeper for all things, then maybe call it the finance and warrant committee and let them look at all the articles. Otherwise, you know, if they're just a finance committee and they're just supposed to be looking at financial implications, then you can limit their review to that. But then who's going to make a recommendation on the others? Who's going to help town meeting decide? And that's really what the finance committee is trying to do, is it's trying to take a deep dive into these various issues and then say, this is what we recommend is in the best interest of the town. So if you're not going to have a recommendation at all, I mean, you don't have to. It could be the sponsor could make a recommendation, the board of selectmen could make a recommendation, or you just have none.
Actually, sorry, I want to go back a little bit. I think this had come up before. In town council form of government, who sponsors the measures that are being voted on?
Counselors.
Solely.
Well, I mean, that's typically the case. There's also different options. You can look at North Attleboro did something that was a little bit different. They have a citizen petition process with 50 signatures can basically bring a matter before the council. They can act on it or not, up to them. So that's not something that's typical.
Yep.
Then there's just a regular initiative petition process, which is you get more signatures, you come in, you say this is what we want. If they don't vote in favor of it, then you can go out and get more signatures and then have it go on the ballot.
Okay.
So, so again, it depends.
Okay. What about, like, specifically a zoning bylaw? is it the, if they wanted to make a change, is one of the planning, land use boards bringing that to town council? And are they then the sponsor, or do they actually need a specific town councilor to sponsor that amendment?
It depends.
Okay.
So, in fact, because the zoning act kind of takes, covers the field or addresses the field, it says all the different ways that a zoning amendment can get to a council. So it can be that the planning board suggests it, it can be that a single counselor suggests it, it can be that the person with a property interest suggests it. So there's different ways for that to happen.
Okay.
But the planning board, that's one of the only boards that's like that.
Okay.
Typically, and again, you have to remember that this is like, just like when we submit a bylaw change, you basically put that in however you get it in there, and then it's up to the whole legislative body what to do with it. So this is the same kind of thing. The charter can address how measures get before. So it could say any member of the council has a right to have a matter be placed on the agenda. It could say that you need the vote of at least 3 to have it placed on the agenda. You don't want to create violations of the open meeting law and have people talking outside of a meeting, so you probably don't want to go higher than 3. But that would override the general rule. You could say a department head could propose a measure. You could say the town manager can propose measures. Up to you guys. Yes?
So while the council would handle, independent articles or things that come about them with the budgetary stuff, how would they go about handling stuff like larger items? For instance, what if a debt exclusion came up? What if an override came through? Like, how does the council, is there different ways to do it, or is it pretty much a set standard way, like, hey, if all of a sudden an override gets discussed, how does that formula work?
The town council is the only entity that has a right to put a Proposition 2.5 question on a ballot.
So even like a debt exclusion where they would vote on it to say yes, it would go to a ballot, and then the town voters would still just have the same right they have now as to go in and.
Yes.
Okay.
The difference is you don't have contingent votes in a city. So, in a city form of government, which a town council is. So what you'd basically have is the council would vote to put the question on the ballot, and it would be voted, and then the council would decide whether to authorize the borrowing in most cases.
If after it was voted on by the
Yeah.
citizens.
Then they
And
would
could go
vote,
in
yeah.
and say, okay.
Or they could, let's say, they said it would be wonderful if we could do a debt exclusion for this, but we have room within the levy to come up with the bond, payments for the next few years. So even if the even if the voters do vote no, we're still gonna do the borrowing now, and we'll try again to get it debt excluded later. It's up to them.
Is it state law that has to be done by the town council to bring that to the voters, or could the voters do like a petition thing like this to then?
There's no petition for Proposition 2.5 other than to lower the tax rate. And that can be done by petition in communities where there is a petition process, and that's it. They cannot petition to increase the tax rate. That has to come from the council. Remember when I was saying the council does some things that are executive in nature? That's an executive thing, putting a question on a ballot. So that's an example of why they're kind of a hybrid in some ways. And just from a practical perspective, what would likely happen there is that the town manager would say, oh, we need this, and then the town manager would do all the work of figuring out the money. Then the town manager would come to the council and say, look, this is the project we need to do, this is how much it's gonna cost, I've analyzed the budget, this is what I think we're gonna need in terms of money to repay the loan, this is where our loans are, this is what's falling off, blah, blah, blah. What do you say, council? And then the council's like, yeah, we approve that, or no, we don't. But it would typically not start with them, because they're appropriating money.
I just asked because it's more to dispel rumors that people think that you go to a town council form of government that they want an override, 9 people are gonna shove an override down. That's why I more ask it just for.
Yeah. Nope, still have to go to.
That the town's not gonna have a vote on that.
You still have to go to the polls.
Like I said, it's more just to dispel rumors.
Yep.
You're on record.
No.
Yes. Okay, any questions in regards to FinCom and recommendations of articles and/or how measures get sponsored or put up for vote? Okay. There was a question with regards to master plan, budget message. Lauren had provided some guidance on that. Was there any follow-up question? Okay. Any further questions on financial fiscal policies and procedures that we haven't addressed? Moving on. Elections, I don't think we had any specific questions. Have any questions that weren't addressed yet? Okay. Moving on to citizen participation. And you overheard part of the conversation that we were having. In the initial question, I had given the example of it took us 6 months to get 20% of the population. And understanding that with a initiative or a recall or a referendum, the timing is of the essence. And if you're going to reverse something, you want to do it quickly so that it hasn't gone into effect. So I think we're all kind of struggling with what is the correct balance between where we are now, where it just takes 200 people to sign a petition to get a special town meeting to vote on something, versus even 5% within even if you give them 30 days, I think is somewhat of an unwieldy proposition. And is that intentional, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I think there's a couple things to think about. Citizen participation with a council form of government is very different. Mostly councils will have a public speak portion of their meeting where they open the floor up to whoever wants to speak about whatever, typically for a certain amount of time, sometimes at the beginning and the end, sometimes just at the beginning, sometimes just at the end. So that's the number one way. Also, there's a single person to go talk to, as a town manager, or the mayor, to say, I'm having this problem with whatever. You know, sometimes at town meeting, we hear someone talk about something that's way off topic, and it's like, well, why didn't they bring this to someone's attention? And they'll say, I didn't know who to talk to. So this is the kind of thing where the job then becomes, there's a person who's supposed to answer those questions. The council, that people also go to the counselors, as I said, and say, like, my street needs to be paved, and that kind of stuff. But formal involvement would be, typically an initiative petition process and a referendum process. The initiative petition process, basically any person can go to any counselor anytime and say, I would love for you to bring this up and propose a measure. And the counselor could say, oh, I think that's a great idea, I'd be happy to. So typically when you see an initiative petition, it's because they cannot move enough of the counselors in a direction. And the idea then is that it should reach a certain hurdle because these counselors have been elected to be the representatives of the people. So if the representatives of the people say, that sounds like a horrible idea to us, you want to be able to make sure that there's enough interest in this and that enough people agree that the council's not making the right choice, that every voter should be able to weigh in. So that's why there's a bar, and it's serious. Now, an initiative petition is not as much of a rush as a referendum. An initiative petition, typically they're going to come before the council first. They're going to ask the council to pass their measure. If the council says no, then they can go out and get more signatures. So usually it's a two-part process. The first part is, hey, enough people said this is important to them. We're asking you to listen and do what we're asking. And then the second half is, okay, now we really want this on the ballot. And that process can take a while. Referendum or referenda are different. A referenda is essentially, a referendum happens when the council makes a decision that people hate. And so in that circumstance, the idea is there's a short window during which the measure doesn't take effect. Usually, it's a 10-day window usually, 14 at the most. And the signatures that are gathered have to be gathered in that time. And that's it. And it usually is a percentage. And it's usually significant, like a 3% or a 5%. And the idea is if enough people are upset about this, that we're gonna override the council's decision, then, show us the signatures, instead of show us the money.
Okay. And then in some cases, we've seen, and what I'm referring to is the kicker, if it actually does go to a ballot vote, it then has another minimum threshold to meet in terms of voter participation, and it's generally 20%.
And that's, again, these are checks and balances. The idea is, the council already made a decision.
Yep.
And they made a decision by whatever the quantum of vote was that was required. And the council has the most information, the most access to information, and they have the most public position. So if they said, we want X, Y, or Z thing, and people are really unhappy about it, that enough people have to care about it to come out for the election to overturn the council's action.
Signing the petition is not enough?
That's because that's a much smaller number.
Okay.
Now, it is not always the case that referenda questions have percentage turnout requirements. And again, if you're going to choose a percentage turnout requirement, I suggest you go back and look at what the percentage turnout is at every annual and special election that you've had in the last 10 years. Because then you can see, oh, we have this many people show up for an annual and this many for a special, so that's X percentage of people. A 20% requirement means that will never be met. Or, we always get 20%. Whichever it is, though, you have data, you can make that decision on.
Okay.
Can I just speak up quick? I think what we read these, given what we see in town meeting in Norton, and having gone around and collecting signatures in this town, like a 20% hurdle is almost inconceivable to us that you could ever achieve, especially in 14 days.
Yeah, we didn't get elected with 20%.
Because you leave the meeting, you go to your job the next day.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying 20% in the 14 days. I was saying some number, like, let's say it's 3% for the petition, or 5%.
Yep.
And then the voter turnout, you have to look at the results. So that's, you'd never be able to, in theory, you could collect 20% of the signatures in 14 days, but it's highly unlikely.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very high bar, but a 20% voter turnout is also a high bar. That, if you never get 20% turnout at a special election, then, you want to be careful about creating that kind of a bar. On the other hand, you don't want to make it so easy that, the winds of, one group kind of take over the government. If those people want to be in government, then let them run for office. That's the balance there. It's a hard job to be a selectman or to be a town councilor. You don't do it for the joy, that comes from sitting at meetings like this night after night. So the people that are in those positions, they are in them, and they've been chosen to do that. And so, the idea is their decision-making, they were elected to make those decisions. So if we're going to overturn them because we, the voters, think they're wrong, we have to mean it. It has to be that important to us, rather than just voting them out the next election.
You had provided a couple of examples, and then I was just more purely interested, have there been examples where there has been a citizen referendum that's been successful?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't know them offhand.
Yep.
But there definitely have.
It's achievable?
It is, yep. It's typically on the most controversial of issues, things like, can we, like a zoning matter, like undoing a zoning matter, particular appropriation for borrowing, people are horrified, they don't want to have to spend the money, debt exclusion fails, so there's that kind of thing.
All right. The last question that we had initially in here was having to do with recall, and specifically on a ballot calling for the recall, allowing the incumbent who may have been recalled in the first question being allowed to run for that same seat again.
So my answer right away was it's constitutionally protected, you have the right to vote. I know that it's in a bunch of other.
Yeah, it's in our
a bunch of other
charter.
charters.
Yeah.
I was looking for the case today. There's a case out there that said that that is a right under Massachusetts law and that it shouldn't be, you can't prevent someone from running if they provide the right number of signatures to run. A lot of times, the person who's holding the office is automatically included on the ballot unless they say no, thank you.
Right.
And so, you know, I guess I'm a little jaded when it comes to recall, because recall is, as you can imagine, it's exceptionally divisive. It's really difficult because the clerk, whoever's, you know, in charge of getting these petitions in, is dealing with the person who's going to be recalled, the angry people that want the recall. There's typically allegations of signature fraud, and it's really difficult. So to me, you want a recall act that does the least damage. And so basically, there's no state recall, so recall provisions are copied one charter to the next, and I think the version that we have now is the best one we've ever had, but I still don't think it's that great. But we try to deal with all the things that people have gotten sued over with respect to recall. I think people will get sued over that. You cannot be a candidate to succeed yourself. That doesn't mean that you can't put it in there if you want and see if the AG approves it. You know, the AG makes a decision about whether the provisions of a proposed charter drafted by a charter commission are consistent with law. So they've approved lots of them.
Yep.
Whether you think that's a good idea. Now, I know that the Fall River situation has a lot of people like, this is crazy, how can this happen? You know, in that case, I think part of the problem is there were so many people running, but that's, you know, that's up to the individuals who are running to also make that decision. Also, people don't understand recall anyway. Those questions, you know, are you in favor of, are you against? And then the candidates, they don't get, like, how are those things related? I think it's Walpole. They don't have an election to fill a vacancy at the same time. They just have recall. So you can recall someone, and then you have to schedule a special election at a different time. So there's a vacancy. If it's a selectman position, it cannot be filled by appointment. But if it's a different position, it can be. There's a vacancy, let's say in the planning board, it can be filled by appointment. Or vacancy in the whatever. So those are things to think about.
So, just because we do have that provision in
Yeah.
Norton that we prohibit
Mhm.
the person from running, I assume the AG approved that?
Yeah, I mean, that's highly likely. I think there was a case, if my brain will permit me to like get back to it. I did also mention it to the elections director, and she's like, I don't remember it either, but I know there's one out there. It's not an appellate level case, but I was obviously swayed by its findings because I still cite to it. But that's, again, you know, the idea of recall is that the person, and you know, and how you draft your recall provision is also really important. You know, that a lot of times it'll say enlist the grounds for recall. I can't remember what yours says. Elected officials typically want to fight about whether the grounds for recall are right and whether they're justified and whether they're appropriate, and whether that really is a ground for recall, whether that is malfeasance or misfeasance or any of these things. And there's case law out there that says it's really not for it doesn't matter. It's whether the people believe that those things are reasons for recall or whatever, but it tends to lead to litigation. Recall is tough. You know, term limits we didn't talk about, but it's kind of a similar thing that the typical way of dealing with these things is at the ballot box every 3 years or every year. And, you know, that's the way that you wind up deciding whether you think people are representing you adequately. And just because you don't agree with the decision that they make doesn't necessarily mean that you should be able to get them removed from office for that decision. You know, because other people don't like other decisions. And so if you have the ability just to remove someone from office anytime you want without a bar that's set high enough, you're just going to have this rolling recall back and forth.
Any follow-up?
I'm good.
Okay. Any other questions within citizen participation? Moving on to general provisions bylaws, I think we answered the question where it doesn't necessarily have to be in a local paper. I think we've seen a few of that. Just wanted to make sure. We've specifically been asked to remove that requirement by a few areas.
Yes, that is the trend for sure.
Yep. Let's see. There was a question specifically regards to Dedham's charter, which Lauren had answered. Were there any follow-up questions to that?
I think the really important thing to remember is if you have a charter committee in a town with either a representative or open town meeting, then even if, let's say, a board of selectmen said, no, we think that's a terrible idea, we're not in favor of it, we're not going to propose it as a warrant article. 10 signatures, and if you have a 9-member committee, it's not a very big deal to get that on an annual town meeting warrant. So I think, in Dedham, they were basically reporting back on what they thought would be good changes. It didn't mean that the board was going to agree with them on that. But again, if they wanted to and the board didn't agree, the board could have put it, they could have gotten it on with just 10 signatures.
It seemed like a waste of the public's time by requiring the hearing and then literally going no further.
Well, there could have been nothing to change. That's perfectly possible.
Yep.
And the other thing is, it didn't mean that it didn't have to go further. It just wasn't mandated to. Again, this is kind of where back and forth between the role of the executive and the role of the legislative. And, the legislative body has the ability to make changes to a charter through its voting. Can it force the executive to put that forward? Not unless a charter says so. So it could say, and any recommendation shall be presented in the form of a warrant article, but what if the idea really is bad? What if it's a bad idea for the town and the 9 people happen to come up with a review that they feel strongly about, but that's, completely out of sync with the people. So it's up to you guys how you deal with that. Instead of reporting to the Board of Selectmen, it could make a report to town meeting. That's another option. Doesn't mean town meeting has to act on it, but it could be a report to town meeting, which then at least make sure that everyone gets to hear it.
Thank you. Any follow-up questions on that one? The next one, I think we've taken part of this, non-compliance with the charter. Another question has come up with ignoring the request. How do you compel somebody to appear?
Okay, you liked how I punted with that in-person discussion, because this is a very difficult topic, and I think the bottom line is, if you want there to be a non-directory provision in the charter, you have to have an enforcement provision with it. So you think about the United States Constitution. It says a lot of things. Most of the time, people comply with it. But sometimes they don't. How do we know? Because they have the right to bring a court case to enforce it. Not every provision, though, has a court case option attached to it. So, there's been a lot of talk in some towns about having a charter enforcement committee. Typically, what those types of things involve are people being upset about personnel decisions that are made. And the question for you to think about is whether that's an appropriate thing for a body that's not the supervisory authority or not the appointing authority to be weighing in on. And I personally believe the idea of the charter is to set the standard, and that's the standard. And so if someone doesn't meet the standard, then it's the job of their appointing authority to deal with them, or it's the job of the voters to vote them out if they're elected. There are things in the charter that you wouldn't really, let's take a deadline, like just February 1 for the budgets. We talked about that before. what happens if they don't get the budget on February 1? Nothing. And really, it couldn't, because what's it gonna be, like town meeting can't act? Or the finance committee can't make recommendations, or the school committee doesn't get to present its budget? None of those things are plausible. So that's why there's really, it's a social compact, you know? You're making an agreement about how things are gonna operate. If there are particular things that you really don't wanna have happen, so Walpole, I don't know what happened in the past, but there's a provision in their charter that says unless they get copies of executed collective bargaining agreements at least 7 days before a town meeting, you have to wait 2 weeks, or town meeting can waive that with a 75% vote. So they're addressing that, and that's a consequence, that's a penalty. So that's not directory, it's mandatory. So we don't get to talk about funding those agreements at town meeting unless, that night, unless they are presented 2 weeks ahead. Or they vote by a 75% vote, which is a really high quantum of vote, to approve essentially the fact that they're gonna talk that night. So those are the types of things you can enforce, things that you're willing to kind of delay or not take action on. But a lot of the other things are really hard. And again, I think, you know, we hear all the time, well, they violated the charter with this, and they violated the charter with that, and that's a violation of the charter. And yes, it's true, technically, you know, they didn't prepare this by this date, and the 5-year budget wasn't posted on the right day, and all these things. And that is a violation of the charter. But there's, a lot of times, there's really good reasons for that. One of the budgetary things that happens frequently is that the governor's budget doesn't come out till late, and then the House budget doesn't come out till later. And so it's really hard to come up with the right kind of format for a municipal budget if you have no idea what the numbers are. So you're waiting to hear about state aid, and then you get this range between the governor's budget and the House budget. So you might not have a final budget by the day it says in the charter you're supposed to have the final budget. But that day is really not there as a drop dead date, because if you don't meet that date, what, no budget at all? No. It's really meant as a guide, you know, a very important guidepost. You know, and you can judge someone on that. We were supposed to have that by whatever date, we didn't get it. You know, why not? That isn't consistent with the charter. Rather than, let's have a charter review committee get together and decide you violated the charter by not getting the budget on that day. What are they gonna do? What's the punishment for that? You know, what can they do? So, again, I think that's part of the reason why the sale aspect of whatever charter you come up with is so important, because people are agreeing these are the rules we're gonna follow. This is what we're aspiring to. And in particular instances, you can look and say, it's essential to us that this happen on this day, and if it doesn't, then we do want a consequence. And then that is mandatory rather than directory.
So, in my opinion, I think a lot of people are disengaged disenfranchised with our local government because we don't do a good job of giving them adequate information with adequate time to be able to. So I think putting these time requirements in it, I think are a little bit important for us. And maybe we do need to think about some kind of a stick, I guess, a punishment if it's not that. And what that looks like, I don't know, but to me, I think that seems to be a resounding issue that we have across the board. And a lot of different areas, not specifically just budget, but not being able to get stuff to people in town fast so they can be able to understand their.
Yeah, even, you know, committees not being provided with information that they're expected to have a discussion on and vote on the same evening.
Again, I think you have to, those are operational issues, they're administrative issues, right? And so in thinking about how to deal with that, does it get better if you have it in the charter saying you have to do it by this day? I don't know that it does. And if they don't do it by that day, and who is gonna be punished is the question. Like, what is the stick? Because for the example I gave you, town meeting was being punished. They came up with a 75% vote because they could not vote if they got the collective bargaining agreement more than 7 days I mean, less than 7 days ahead, but sometimes they didn't settle the agreements until less than 7 days ahead. So then town meeting could not take a vote that night legally. So that's why they have that 75%, emergency escape valve or whatever. I think it's worthy of thinking about how do you write into your charter these expectations for voter information, for committee information, et cetera, in a way that encourages people to do it, that doesn't necessarily create this thing where people are saying, and you violated the charter, 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 because that's also, it doesn't work exceptionally well.
Well, Medicaid have exceptions for everything, right? Because it builds in some kind of exception tab.
Mm-hmm.
But, I don't know, just something to think about.
Yep.
Yeah. I think it's an excellent point that you brought up. I think it is, I think it's a hot issue in this town.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not saying it is or isn't one way or another, because I'm not a board or committee that's waiting to get information. But I think there's a difference between what we're able to look at on a paper and say, that makes sense, and what it's actually like to be in the day-to-day. And those two things aren't necessarily the same. Some towns do what they think is basically a hybrid, so they'll say, by December 30th, the town manager shall issue a budget schedule and provide it to all departments and department heads and all boards and committees. In North Attleboro, I think they put in there that the budget and budget message have to be online by a certain time, but then they say, but failure to do so shall not render a vote on the budget invalid. So, yes, we want it there, but if it doesn't happen, it doesn't stop us from moving forward. Those are just some of the things that you can think about.
Any other questions on that topic?
An elected official ignoring a request by the executive branch?
Yeah.
So that's something you can write into the charter. And that basically is, you can say that, let's say executive branch is a board of selectmen, you could say that notwithstanding the fact that they're separately elected bodies, that they are subject to the call of the board of selectmen. The thing is that there's no way to punish elected officials for not doing what they're asked, except for not voting for them again or recalling them. That's really, because a board, if let's say a member of a board is behaving in a way that other board members find objectionable, they can sanction that board member. They can say, we will not sit at this table with you. They can say, we're not going to engage in this kind of talk. But that's where it ends. Even a sanction, it's just saying, we don't like how you're behaving. You can't do anything to them. So it's different when you're supervising someone who's appointed, because you can say, do that again, and there's going to be a repercussion, and whatever it is, you're being warned, this is your last chance, this is a last chance agreement. There's some control there. With elected officials, they are answerable to the public. So it complicates things.
Well, they're answerable to the public, provided the public is aware of the elected officials ignoring a Board of Selectmen request.
Yes. So, in city charters or council charters, there's specific language in there about who can ask an employee to come before the council. And I think it's Amherst, but it might be North Attleboro, I can't remember exactly. If, the council can require the manager to come before it, but has to give a list of the things that it wants to know about ahead of time. But they can't require a person appointed by the manager to go. They can direct the manager to request that person to go. Because the idea is they're not answerable to the council, they're answerable to their appointing authority. Then they're also, typically another kind of way of dealing with that is giving investigatory authority to various entities. So let's say you have a council and a manager, you have the council able to do investigations and the manager able to do investigations. So that way they can kind of check and balance each other.
Any other questions on this? Just talked about the use of the term appointed versus hired for paid positions and whether there was any
I know this-
rationale. Yeah.
This is a thing, we talk about it almost every time that I sit with a charter review committee or commission. In the laws, the general laws, it says appoint a so-and-so for this many years and appoint a so-and-so for that many years, and that's why it says appoint in most charters. Appoint suggests it's appointed for a term of years. It might not be, it could just be appointed for at will, but that's, usually you see people that are appointed to certain positions, but you wouldn't see staff, like general staff, talk about appointments there, it's talk about hiring there.
There was one question, and I don't really know where this fits. Does state law require a town employee that receives a stipend to be eligible for municipal health insurance?
No.
Okay.
It's chapter 32B, section 2, I think, D, and I don't make these things up. And basically what it says is that if you work 20 hours or more, then you are automatically entitled to whatever the health insurance program is. It says that the select board can vote to make elected officials eligible for health insurance regardless of how many hours they work.
Okay.
If an elected official works at least 20 hours, then they are automatically also entitled to health insurance. So in some towns, the Board of Selectmen have voted to say that people, elected officials, who are not full-time employees essentially, are eligible for health insurance. So getting a stipend, as long as they get paid. So as long as they get a stipend, any amount, even $1, they get health insurance. And so there you will see towns try to zero out the elected officials' pay. Now, other towns have actually gone to the general court for special acts that prohibit that elected officials, part-time elected officials, from receiving health insurance, so.
All set? Okay. Any other questions on general provisions or bylaws? Transitional provisions. Do elected boards need to be re-elected after the change?
No.
That's been addressed. Any further follow-up? And bylaw changes related to charter commission recommendations.
So if you're super organized, like Mark Fisher in North Attleboro, you might do all of that ahead of time, but it's not required. You know, charters supersede inconsistent provisions of bylaws.
Okay.
So to the extent that, you know, that the bylaws don't say the right thing, it doesn't matter if it says Board of Selectmen versus Select Board, or if it said open town meeting versus representative town, it doesn't matter. What you can do in your transitional provisions is address anything that's significant in terms of like, who's gonna have the job of this in this new world? Well, this person will, at least until the council votes this way. So you'll see a number of kind of, this will be the status quo until decisions are made also, otherwise.
In North Attleboro, so when they voted on the recommendations of the charter commissions and those changes, were they also voting in the bylaws at the same time?
No, they didn't.
No.
No. Because who knew if the charter was gonna change?
Okay. That's what I didn't know if it was tied in some way and if.
No, because also they did an elected charter commission like you guys, so that means that nothing goes to town meeting. It goes straight to the ballot.
Okay.
Your proposal, it doesn't go to town meeting.
Okay.
So did
But-
you just ask if they voted on the ballot at the same time?
Yeah.
In North Attleboro, so they had made the bylaw changes at the same time that they made their charter amendments and recommendations. And I was asking, did the citizens vote on that at the same time as the charter recommendation question?
Gotcha.
No, and in Amherst, for example, there was a bylaw review committee that was appointed after the charter commission was elected, and that bylaw review committee made some recommendations to the new council, but the council was like, we haven't even read those yet, so thank you for all of your work, and we're gonna look at this in a few weeks when things get settled. But there were a few things that were very important to deal with right away, and those things we did wind up getting changed at the first meeting.
When North Attleboro did their charter, and because they were organized and had the bylaws kind of already done, did that all go in one shot, like, this was all changing, or did it, like, here's the charter, and now the bylaws are all set, so we can improve that after?
The bylaws had to be changed separately.
Okay.
Because the charter's changed by the voters, bylaws, ordinances changed by the legislative branch. So they're not at the same time. And if there's an inconsistency, the charter trumps.
So in one that you said that they changed a couple of provisions that were important, did they highlight those when they presented them and said, here's the bylaws, but here's the ones that are really?
Yes. Well, basically, the committee was like, oh, this is too, the council's like, this is too much, we can't do this, and they said, okay, wait, these are the ones that we really want you to look at, these are the ones you should deal with. And that was where there wasn't enough in the charter to clarify exactly who would have what role, and so that was just, it might have been related to underground storage tanks or something. I mean, it's something like that you wouldn't necessarily think was a big deal, but it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Just particular to that particular town.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on transitional provisions? Any other general questions for Lauren while we have her? We thank you very, very much for your time. Did you win?
Yes.
Yay!
What did you mean?
5 to 3.
Yes, yes.
Which is good.
Excellent. I'm sorry you missed the end of it.
Oh, no, that's okay. You know what's great about that fact that they won? I'll have
You get another game.
to go to.
Yeah,
Well, that means I'm going to be late to some other meeting.
probably.
Thank you guys very
We do.
much.
We appreciate
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Oh, we have to vote. Oh, God. All right, everybody has had a chance to review the remote participation policy by the town of Norton?
Yes.
Okay, anybody have any questions or want any discussion? All right, I've already amended the agenda for the next meeting in advance. Good night, Lauren, thank you. I will take a motion to accept the remote participation policy of the town of Norton, adopted by the Board of Selectmen on October 21st, 2019.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
No further discussion? And I think we have to vote individually.
Second? Kevin.
Can I just
Was
ask
this-
a quick question?
Yes.
I know this was on the agenda Monday and we voted to push it. I don't see it on today's agenda. Can
We-
we vote?
I think so, because we've got, well, we do have on there, we
I
may vote
tabled
on
it.
things.
I just tabled it for this meeting, so.
Yeah, we can call
I
it
just didn't
something
know.
not expected
Yeah.
within 48 hours. At the end of the day, does it really matter? Does,
I just don't want to get yelled at.
no.
I say we're good.
Okay. What say you? It doesn't really matter.
I mean, it's not-
Is Lauren still here?
No?
I mean, it was during the meeting that we
Yeah.
tabled it,
Yeah.
so there was notice.
Worst case, we'll just
Yeah.
vote on it again.
Yeah.
If we have to.
vote on it again.
Okay, so we had a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any other discussion?
A quick question. Well, I guess, I'm sorry. But don't we, I thought we had, my understanding is the latest version has to be signed by everybody.
Yes, Sandy will have something that'll pass around to sign. Question, does this have to be a roll call vote? That was one thing that was not clear. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? So moved. Any other items for discussion? Are we done? I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? We're adjourned.